There is a particular kind of silence that follows a catastrophe. Not the silence of peace, and not the silence of sleep, but the silence of a world that has just changed shape and has not yet found the words to describe what it has become. On the 10th of December 1941, somewhere in the South China Sea, that silence fell. Two of the most powerful warships Britain had ever sent east slipped beneath grey-green water in a matter of hours. Alongside them went nearly 900 men, and something less tangible but just as real, an entire way of thinking about naval warfare, about empire, about the kind of power that could be projected across oceans, and what it was actually worth when tested. A belief that had taken decades to build sank in minutes. This is not a story about defeat alone. It is something more complicated and, in many ways, more human than that. It is a story about the convictions people carry into danger, convictions built from experience, from pride, from the long habit of being right, and what happens when the world turns out to be different from the one those convictions were designed for. It is a story about men who sailed into the South China Sea on orders they had doubts about, who kept their doubts quiet, who did their duty, and who paid for decisions made far above them with everything they had. It is a story worth sitting with. So if you are settling in tonight, finding your position, letting the weight of the day begin to lift, you are exactly where this story wants you to be. Let the hours ahead carry you through one of the most consequential and least told chapters of the Second World War, and when you wake, you will know something you did not before. The ships were called HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. Between them they represented two distinct generations of British naval power, one new and battle-scarred, the other old and battle-tested, both magnificent, both mortal in ways their commanders had not fully reckoned with. Together they sailed under the designation Force C, a name that carried more weight in political calculations than it did in military reality. The man in command was Vice Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, precise, self-assured, and shaped by an age of naval thinking that was already, by the autumn of 1941, beginning to pass. He had reached the upper echelons of the Royal Navy through intelligence and administrative brilliance, and he carried with him a settled conviction that the threat posed by aircraft to capital ships at sea had been overstated by younger, louder voices than his own. He was not a foolish man. He was, in many respects, a formidably capable one. But he held his convictions the way certain men do, with a firmness that made revision feel like surrender. That firmness would cost him everything. To understand how Force Z came to be in the South China Sea at all, you have to understand Singapore, the great fortress at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, the cornerstone of British power in the Far East, a place so invested with strategic meaning and imperial pride that its vulnerabilities had become almost impossible to discuss honestly within the corridors of British planning. Singapore had a naval base of enormous scale. It had guns of tremendous range and weight. What it did not have, in the crucial days of December 1941, was a fleet. The fleet had always been the promise. The entire defensive logic of Singapore rested on the understanding that if a serious threat ever materialized, warships would come. That promise had been made and remade across decades, through one government and then another, through peace and the gathering dark of a second war. By the time it needed to be kept, the cupboard was nearly bare. What Britain could spare was 2 capital ships, 4 destroyers, and a great deal of hope. Churchill had his reasons. He always did. The mere presence of a powerful squadron in Singapore waters, he believed, would give Japan reason to hesitate. Capital ships in harbour were a form of deterrence. A signal sent to Tokyo that Britain's reach still extended this far, that the empire's arteries were still open, that the cost of aggression would be prohibitive. It was a strategic argument with real logic behind it. It was also, as events would prove, fatally dependent on assumptions about Japanese caution that the Japanese had already decided not to honor. Japan had spent years developing something the British had underestimated, a land-based naval air doctrine of extraordinary precision, flown by crews who had been training specifically for the problem of finding and destroying warships at sea. They were not improvising. They were not experimenting. They had prepared. While British planners were still debating how much of a threat aircraft really posed to a well-handled capital ship, Japanese air crews were practicing the exact attack profiles that would answer the question once and for all. And then came Pearl Harbor, the 7th of December 1941, across the international dateline, the 8th in Singapore, and everything changed. The Pacific Fleet's battleships lay burning in shallow water. The strategic map of an entire ocean was redrawn overnight. What had been a tense standoff became a war, and the comfortable assumptions that had governed British thinking in the Far East became dangerous, in the same instant that they became irrelevant. Phillips put his ships to sea the following evening. He did so without guaranteed air cover. He did so with incomplete intelligence. He did so into waters where Japanese aircraft had already demonstrated their reach. He had his reasons too, the same kind of reasons that serious, experienced men give when duty and momentum and the weight of command override the quieter voice that might otherwise counsel pause. 3 days after leaving Singapore, neither ship would exist above the waterline. In the chapters that follow, we will move through every layer of this story. We will sit in the map rooms and the signals offices where decisions were made and messages were missed. We will stand on the bridges of ships that are beginning to understand what they are facing. We will cross to the Japanese air bases in southern Indochina, where crews were briefed and engines turned over in the pre-dawn hours of the 10th of December. We will watch the battle unfold from both sides, and we will stay with the men in the water when it was over. We will also ask the harder questions about blame, about inquiry, about the institutional habits that made this kind of disaster not just possible, but, in retrospect, nearly predictable. And we will close where the ships themselves now rest, on the floor of the South China Sea, designated as war graves, still home to the men who could not be saved. If you are new here, welcome. This channel exists to carry you through history's most consequential nights, one documented chapter at a time. If this kind of long, careful storytelling is what you come here for, then settling in and subscribing means you will never wake to find a chapter missing. For those of you already here, you know the rhythm. The lights go low, the world gets quieter, and we begin. This is the untold history of the sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse, Britain's worst naval day, and the end of an era that the men living through it had not yet realized was ending. Settle in. There is an island at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula where the land finally runs out of room and gives itself over to the sea. In 1941, that island was called Singapore, and to the British Empire, it represented something far greater than geography. It was a promise made visible in concrete and steel, a declaration that Britain's reach extended not just across oceans, but into permanence itself. The naval base constructed there, over the course of 2 decades, had cost more than £60 million, a figure so vast it drew protests in Parliament and incredulity in the press. Its dry docks could swallow the largest warships afloat. Its fuel reserves, its workshops, its machine rooms and magazines were built on a scale that announced serious intent. Standing at its edge, and looking out across the Strait of Johor, a person might reasonably have concluded that this was a place the British Empire intended to keep forever. The strategic idea behind Singapore was elegant in the way that ideas become elegant when they are never fully tested. Britain could not permanently station a major fleet in the Far East. The costs were prohibitive, and the Royal Navy had more immediate responsibilities closer to home. What it could do was build a base so formidable, so fully equipped, that a fleet dispatched at short notice from Europe could arrive and operate from Singapore immediately, with every need anticipated and every facility waiting. This concept had a name within Admiralty planning circles: the Main Fleet to Singapore strategy. The assumption woven through it was that such a fleet would always come in time, that the window between a crisis beginning and a crisis becoming catastrophic would be long enough for ships to cross oceans and arrive before the worst unfolded. It was a strategy that required things to go right in sequence, in exactly the right order. Strategies that depend on sequential good fortune have a particular kind of fragility. The fixed gun batteries positioned around Singapore were formidable in their own right, and they have suffered unfairly in the telling of this story ever since. The guns pointing south and east toward the sea were not, as legend would later insist, exclusively pointed in the wrong direction. Several of the heavier batteries could in fact traverse to cover northern and landward approaches. But what those batteries could not do was compensate for an absence of shells. The magazines were stocked predominantly with armor-piercing rounds, designed to punch through the hulls of warships, precisely because the threat Singapore's planners had imagined was a naval assault from the sea. High-explosive rounds, the kind needed to break up infantry and armor, advancing through jungle, were in critically short supply. The guns were real. The threat they had been built to meet was not the threat that was coming. Capability without correct anticipation is a very expensive form of helplessness. By the late 1930s, the seams in the Main Fleet to Singapore strategy were beginning to show in ways that thoughtful people found alarming. Hitler's Germany had resurrected a powerful navy and was pressing against Britain in the Atlantic and the North Sea. Italy's fleet had made the Mediterranean a contested zone demanding constant attention. The idea that Britain could strip its European waters of capital ships and send them east with any confidence was becoming harder to argue with each passing year. Internal Admiralty assessments grew more cautious, their language more hedged. Commitments were quietly softened. The guarantee of relief that Singapore had been sold on began to resemble something closer to an aspiration, a statement of hope dressed in the language of policy. Politicians in London knew this. Some of them chose not to say it plainly to the people who needed to hear it most. The men responsible for defending Malaya and Singapore in 1941 were working with assumptions that had calcified into something close to institutional belief. The Army Command held a genuine conviction that the jungle interior of the Malay Peninsula was impassable to a modern military force in any meaningful strength, that the terrain itself was a natural fortification. The logic followed that any invader would have to come by sea, and a seaborne assault could be met at the waterline. What this view could not account for was an enemy willing to move light, to use bicycles and small craft and footpaths, to treat the jungle not as an obstacle, but as a corridor. The gap between the threat as it was imagined and the threat as it was being planned in Tokyo was not small. It was the width of an entire war. Singapore's population in 1941 was more than 500,000 people, a layered and complex city of many communities, Chinese, Malay, Indian, European, whose daily lives were woven together in commerce and labor, and all the ordinary business of a major port. For most of them, the fortress quality of the island was taken as a given, part of the background of life, in the same way that the heat and the monsoon rains were background. The naval base was a presence felt more than directly seen, a source of employment, of naval personnel in the streets, of a low-level reassurance that Britain had made its intentions here permanent. What the civilian population could not know was how thinly that reassurance was stretched behind the official face it presented. They had been given no reason to doubt, and many reasons to trust, that the defences above them would hold. The Royal Air Force's position in the Far East was, by the middle of 1941, a source of private anxiety at every level of command that understood it clearly. The aircraft available to defend Malaya and Singapore were not modern machines. The Brewster Buffalo fighter, upon which much of the air defense depended, had already been judged inadequate for European skies and redirected east on the understanding that the opponents it would face there might be less demanding. That understanding was catastrophically wrong. Japanese naval air crews were flying machines of genuine sophistication, trained to standards that would have surprised anyone relying on pre-war intelligence assessments of Japanese capabilities. The myth of Japanese technical inferiority, casual, racist, and lethal, was embedded deep enough in British institutional culture that evidence contradicting it had difficulty finding purchase. The Admiralty in London had spent much of the interwar period engaged in a slow, unresolved argument about the relationship between air power and sea power, specifically whether land-based aircraft operating over open ocean could represent a mortal threat to capital ships defended by their own anti-aircraft armament. The Navy's most conservative voices held that a properly handled battleship, maneuvering at speed, surrounded by the weight of its own gunfire, was a match for any aircraft. This was not an unreasonable position, given the experience available in the 1930s. The problem was that the evidence gathering had not kept pace with the development of the weapons themselves. The high-altitude precision bomber, and above all the low-level torpedo aircraft, had evolved faster than the doctrines designed to counter them. Believing in the invulnerability of the capital ship had become, by 1941, a matter of professional faith rather than demonstrated fact. What made Singapore's strategic position particularly fragile in the final months of 1941 was the cumulative weight of things that had not been done and the promises that had been made on the assumption they eventually would be. Airfields had been constructed across northern Malaya to provide warning and interception capability, but they had been built without adequate aircraft to fill them, or adequate ground forces to defend them, which meant they were as useful to an advancing enemy as to the defenders. Reinforcement convoys were moving towards Singapore, carrying troops and equipment, but they were moving on timelines calculated to arrive comfortably, not urgently. The official position remained that war in the Pacific was not imminent, that Japan would not risk a conflict with both Britain and the United States simultaneously. Officials who believed this were not foolish people. They were people whose belief was convenient, and convenience has a way of surviving longer than it should. The naval base itself, for all its concrete grandeur, had one irreducible vulnerability that no amount of engineering could address. It was a facility without a fleet. It could receive a fleet, supply a fleet, repair a fleet, and sustain a fleet in the field almost indefinitely. What it could not do was generate one. The ships had to come from somewhere, and by the autumn of 1941, it was painfully apparent to anyone looking at a map of British naval dispositions that the somewhere in question was a very long way away, with a very great deal of war between here and there. The promise at the heart of the Singapore strategy, that the fleet would come, had not yet been formally abandoned. It had simply been made contingent on so many other things going right that it had ceased to be a plan and become a wish. By November of 1941, Japan had been massing forces in southern Indochina for weeks, in numbers and configurations that pointed unambiguously toward offensive action. British intelligence was aware of this. American intelligence was aware of this. The remaining question was not whether Japan would move, but where, and whether the warning, when it came, would arrive early enough to matter. Singapore stood at the edge of this gathering storm, with its dry docks full of machinery, its magazines full of the wrong ammunition, its airfields waiting for aircraft that were not yet there, and its whole elaborate architecture of defense resting on a naval guarantee that the world had quietly moved beyond. The guns were pointed at the sea. The sea, for the moment, was calm. But the 10th of December 1941 was already taking shape in planning rooms, 1,000 miles away, and the fortress at the end of the peninsula had no idea what form the danger would take when it finally arrived. There is a particular kind of ship that carries its history on its hull, not in the logbooks locked below deck, but in the way sailors speak about it in port, in the way dock workers go quiet when it passes, in the way a name becomes something heavier than a name. In the autumn of 1941, 2 such ships rode at anchor in British waters, each famous for entirely different reasons, and each about to be drawn into a decision made not by admirals, but by prime ministers, not by strategy alone, but by the older, cruder force of political necessity. One was barely finished. One was older than the men who crewed her. Together they would form the whole of Force C, a fleet built for a gesture, dispatched into a war that had no patience for gestures. HMS Prince of Wales had been laid down before the war began and launched in the spring of 1941 into a world already burning. She was a King George V class battleship, among the most modern capital ships the Royal Navy had yet placed in the water. Her main armament ran to 10 14-inch guns, arranged across 3 turrets, supplemented by a secondary battery and an anti-aircraft suite that her designers believed represented the state of the art. She displaced somewhere in the region of 45,000 tons at full load, could push close to 28 knots, and carried a crew of well over 1,000 officers and men. On paper, she was formidable. In practice, she was a ship still being understood by the men who sailed her, a vessel whose machinery had yet to settle into the reliable rhythms that only accumulated sea time can produce. She had been commissioned into service and almost immediately pressed into an action that would have tested any warship, let alone one still sorting out its mechanical temperament. That action was the pursuit of the German battleship Bismarck in May of 1941. Prince of Wales had been rushed into the Denmark Strait engagement, with civilian technicians still working inside her, men who had to crouch behind her armored bulkheads as the guns fired. She had duelled with Bismarck alongside HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, and she had scored hits on the German ship, contributing to the flooding that would ultimately doom Bismarck. But she had also taken hits in return, enough to force her captain to break off the action. Then Hood exploded. 3 men survived from a crew of more than 1,400. Prince of Wales withdrew into the North Atlantic mist, damaged but afloat, carrying wounds that would take months to fully repair, and a crew that had watched the nearest thing to a catastrophe from close enough to feel it. That experience lived aboard her. It lived in the metal that had been patched and refitted. It lived in the memory of officers who had given the order to turn away while Hood was still burning. HMS Repulse was a different creature entirely, different in age, in character, and in the kind of loyalty she inspired. She was a battle cruiser, a class of warship whose very name contained its own philosophical tension, the speed of a cruiser, the guns of a battleship, but armor that was somewhere between the two and satisfied neither ambition completely. Repulse had been launched during the First World War, a product of that earlier era of naval design, when speed was prized above protection, and the battlecruiser concept seemed like a brilliant solution to a problem that would eventually prove the concept fatally wrong. By 1941, she was over 25 years old. Ancient by the standards of modern naval warfare, she had been modernized at various points across the intervening decades. Her anti-aircraft armament improved, her superstructure altered, but she remained fundamentally a ship of an earlier war wearing newer paint. What she had was reputation. Among sailors, Repulse was beloved in a way that the newer, more technically impressive ships rarely inspired. She had the quality of an old house that fits well, familiar, proven, known in her peculiarities by the men who lived inside her. Her crew, many of whom had served aboard her for considerable time, spoke of her with the kind of unsentimental affection that experienced sailors reserve for ships that have never quite let them down. Her captain, William Tennant, was a man whose own reputation was substantial. He had served at Dunkirk, had been the senior naval officer on the beaches during the evacuation, and had the distinction of being the last British officer to leave. He was not a man given to panic, nor to the sort of institutional deference that discourages difficult questions. He understood the sea's capacity for punishment in ways that only experience teaches. He had taken Repulse and accepted his orders, but those who knew him understood that acceptance did not mean the absence of reservation. The decision to send these two ships, one brand new and battle-scarred, one venerable and beloved, to Singapore in the closing weeks of 1941, was not made by the men who would sail them. It was made in Whitehall and in Downing Street, and it was made under pressures that had as much to do with appearances as with operational reality. Churchill had long been troubled by the vulnerability of Singapore, the great naval base that Britain had spent enormous resources constructing across 2 decades. Singapore was the cornerstone of British power in the Far East. Its defense rested on a fundamental promise that when danger came, a fleet would arrive. By late 1941, the danger was not theoretical any longer. Japan was moving, clearly and systematically, toward war. The question was not whether British strength in the region needed bolstering, but what form that bolstering could realistically take. The original proposal had been more ambitious. There had been discussion of assembling a genuine balanced fleet, capital ships supported by an aircraft carrier, destroyers in sufficient number, a force that could operate across the full range of naval warfare. HMS Indomitable, a modern carrier, had been designated to accompany the capital ships. She ran aground during trials in the Caribbean and could not make the sailing date. That accident, unconnected to any enemy action, removed at a stroke the element that might have made the difference between the force that sailed and a force that was genuinely capable. The decision to proceed without her has been debated ever since. The carrier's absence was known. The implications of that absence were understood, at least by some of the men making the decision. They proceeded anyway, because the political momentum behind the deployment had by that point become difficult to reverse without an admission of weakness that Churchill was unwilling to make. The reasoning had its own internal logic, even if that logic would not survive contact with reality. A modern battleship and a fast battlecruiser, even without a carrier, presented a real threat to Japanese surface operations in the region. They were powerful enough to disrupt any amphibious operation they could reach. Their presence alone, the knowledge that British capital ships were at Singapore, was believed to have a deterrent value that Churchill and some of his advisors rated highly. This was not an unreasonable thing to believe. Naval deterrence had functioned in roughly this way for well over a century. Capital ships at anchor had stopped wars before they started, had made admirals on the opposing side reconsider ambitions they had been nursing. The flaw in the logic was not that deterrence was irrational, it was that the form of war Japan was preparing to wage did not function according to the deterrence model that British strategic culture had internalized over generations. Force Z was placed under the command of Vice Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, whose appointment carried its own significance. Phillips had spent the war thus far in London, serving at the highest levels of naval planning, a man of considerable administrative intelligence, but limited recent sea experience. He was small, precise, and certain. Certain in particular about matters of air power and its limitations as a threat to properly handled warships. His convictions on this point were genuinely held and not without basis in the incomplete evidence available at the time, but they were convictions formed in an era that was ending, and the war he was sailing into had no interest in how the last war had been fought. The chapter that covers Phillips in full will examine the man in greater depth. For now, it is enough to note that the admiral selected to command the only capital ships Britain had in the Far East was a man who had not yet been given reason to doubt his assumptions. On the 1st of December 1941, less than 2 weeks before their destruction, Prince of Wales and Repulse arrived at Singapore to considerable ceremony. They were received with the kind of public enthusiasm that attends the arrival of visible power. The local population, the colonial administration, the garrison troops, all of them found in the sight of the two great ships something they needed to find, proof that Britain had not forgotten them, that the mother country's reach extended even to this far margin of empire. Photographs were taken, officials came aboard, the ships were toured and admired. For those who understood what was actually coming, the intelligence reports that described Japanese preparations for war in terrifying detail, the ceremony must have had a particular quality of unreality to it. Aboard both ships, among the officers who knew their situation clearly, there was pride in the vessels they served, alongside anxiety about the conditions of their deployment. They had good ships. Repulse was old, but she was fast, and her crew was exceptional. Prince of Wales was powerful and modern, and had already proved she could take punishment and survive. What they did not have was the third element of any modern naval force operating in range of enemy air power, the covering umbrella of friendly aircraft that could fight off torpedo bombers before they released, that could drive away reconnaissance planes before they reported, that could turn a naval action into a contest between ships rather than a slaughter from above. What they had instead was the assurance that such cover could be arranged, as needed, with the RAF on the island behind them. It was an assurance that events would make hollow within days. But on those first December evenings, with the great ships at anchor in the warm water, their guns polished, their flags flying, the assurance felt like something. By the autumn of 1941, Winston Churchill had been carrying the war on his shoulders for almost 18 months. He had watched France fall, survived the Blitz, and kept Britain fighting when almost every rational calculation said it could not. He was a man who understood power, not just the exercise of it, but the theatre of it, the way that the appearance of strength could sometimes do the work of strength itself. And it was this instinct, sharpened by years of imperial thinking and tempered by genuine strategic pressure, that drove one of the most consequential decisions of the entire Pacific War. Churchill wanted to send capital ships to Singapore. He wanted the world, and specifically Japan, to see them arrive. The diplomatic background to that decision was dense, with tension that had been building for years. Japan had been fighting in China since 1937, consuming resources at a rate that made expansion southward into resource-rich European colonies almost inevitable. The United States had responded with escalating economic pressure, freezing Japanese assets, cutting off steel exports, and finally, in the summer of 1941, imposing an embargo on oil that struck at the very foundation of Japan's war machine. Britain had followed Washington's lead, as had the Dutch government in exile, controlling the oil fields of the East Indies. Tokyo's military planners were working on a clock, none of them publicly acknowledged. Without oil, Japan's navy had perhaps 2 years of operational fuel remaining. The pressure to act, to seize what could not be bought, was enormous and growing by the month. Churchill knew this. His intelligence services and diplomatic cables left him in little doubt that Japan was preparing for a major offensive, most likely aimed at Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and possibly the Philippines. What he also understood, or believed he understood, was that Japan was not yet committed to open war with Britain and the United States simultaneously. Tokyo's military planners were bold, but they were not, in Churchill's estimation, suicidal. A clear and unmistakable signal of British naval resolve in the Far East might, he reasoned, give even the most aggressive faction in Tokyo pause. The presence of capital ships in Asian waters would not need to fire a single shell to accomplish their strategic purpose. They would simply need to exist, visibly, within striking distance of Japanese ambitions. This was deterrence in its most theatrical form. The ship Churchill fixed upon as the centerpiece of this gesture was HMS Prince of Wales, brand new, recently bloodied in her duel with the Bismarck, and unmistakably the kind of vessel that announced serious intent. There was symbolism in the choice that Churchill clearly relished. Prince of Wales had carried him across the Atlantic to meet Roosevelt at the conference that produced the Atlantic Charter. She was associated, in the public mind, with Allied solidarity and resolve. Sending her east, Churchill believed, would be read correctly by Japan, by the United States, by Australia, and by the British public, as evidence that the empire could walk and fight on more than one front at once. The politics of the thing were almost as important to him as the strategy. The internal debate within the Admiralty was considerably less comfortable than Churchill's confident exterior suggested. The First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, had genuine reservations, not about sending capital ships to Singapore in principle, but about sending them without adequate air cover. Pound was not a man who wore his doubts loudly, and he has been criticized by historians for failing to push back with sufficient force when Churchill's mind was made up. But the concerns were real, and they were documented. The question of fighter escort, specifically whether the RAF could provide it in the Far East, hung over every discussion of the deployment, like smoke that nobody quite wanted to address directly. The answers, when pressed, were not reassuring. There was also the question of what exactly these ships were supposed to do once they arrived. Deterrence, as a strategy, depends on the other side believing you are both capable and willing to follow through. A capital ship sitting in a harbour, however impressive, deters nothing the moment an adversary calculates that sending it into actual combat is politically impossible. Some within the Admiralty questioned whether the Japanese would be deterred at all, or whether they would simply note the position of the ships and plan accordingly. These voices did not prevail. Churchill's view, backed by the weight of his personality and his position, carried the room. The broader strategic context, pressing on Churchill at this moment, deserves to be understood clearly. Britain, in late 1941, was not in a position to deploy naval strength on a whim. The Mediterranean was consuming warships at a terrible rate. The Battle of the Atlantic was unresolved and murderous. The Royal Navy was being asked to do far more than it had the hulls and crews to sustain. Sending 2 capital ships to Singapore, even a new battleship and an aging battlecruiser, represented a genuine commitment, not a throwaway gesture. Churchill was not gambling carelessly. He was gambling under genuine constraint, with limited cards, and the constant awareness that he needed to keep the Americans engaged and the Australians reassured without stripping the Atlantic of the resources protecting Britain's own supply lines. The relationship with Washington shaped everything. Churchill's great strategic ambition in 1941 was to bring the United States fully into the war, not as a sympathetic supplier, but as a combatant ally. He had cultivated Roosevelt with extraordinary care, and he understood that American public and congressional opinion remained deeply cautious about any conflict in the Pacific. A demonstration of British commitment to the defense of the Far East served the Anglo-American relationship as much as it served any purely military purpose. If Britain was seen to be standing firm in Asia, to be putting its finest ships in harm's way, rather than retreating into a purely European posture, it strengthened the case Churchill was constantly making in Washington, that Britain was worth backing, that it would fight. The Australian dimension added another layer of calculation. Canberra had been pushing London for years to honour the promises embedded in the Singapore strategy, the assurance that a substantial fleet would be stationed in the Far East if the situation demanded it. Australia had sent divisions to fight in North Africa and the Mediterranean, partly on the faith that Singapore was secure, that the naval base would function as promised, that the Empire's defensive architecture in the East was sound. By late 1941, the Australians were becoming anxious. The arrival of Prince of Wales and Repulse was, in part, an answer to that anxiety, a visible, steaming, photogenic answer that could be announced to the Australian press and presented as proof that London had not forgotten its obligations to the Southern Dominion. Churchill's optimism about Japan's likely response was not entirely baseless, even if it proved entirely wrong. There was a genuine school of thought, shared by some American analysts as well as British ones, that Japan would hesitate to open war on 2 major Western powers simultaneously, particularly after Pearl Harbor had already placed American opinion firmly against appeasement. The logic ran that Tokyo would probe, would apply pressure, would perhaps even launch limited operations. But that full-scale war against both Britain and the United States at once was a step that even Japan's most aggressive planners would calculate carefully before taking. Churchill was not alone in making this misjudgment, but he was the one who acted on it, and acted on it with ships that could not be replaced. What Churchill did not fully reckon with, what perhaps nobody in London fully reckoned with, was the speed and the coordination of what Japan was actually planning. The operation taking shape in Tokyo's military headquarters was not a cautious probe or a carefully limited offensive designed to keep Britain and America uncertain about Japan's intentions. It was a simultaneous strike across an enormous arc of geography, designed to present the Allied powers with fates accompli so numerous and so devastating that piecemeal response would be impossible. The capital ships Churchill was relying upon to deter this offensive would not have the luxury of sitting visibly in harbour, projecting power by their mere existence. They would find themselves, almost immediately, at the edge of the operational envelope, facing an enemy that had spent months planning for exactly this confrontation. The Admiralty's descent was real, documented, and ultimately overridden. The concerns about air cover were filed, noted, and set aside in favour of a political and strategic calculus that Churchill controlled and Churchill drove. This is not a story of recklessness exactly. Churchill was rarely reckless in his reading of strategic necessity, but it is a story of certainty outrunning evidence. The Prime Minister believed that the ships would deter, the ships would sail. And somewhere between the confidence with which that order was given and the reality waiting for them in the South China Sea, something essential had been missed, something that no amount of political theatre or naval prestige could correct once the aircraft were already in the air. There is a particular kind of confidence that belongs to men who have never been seriously wrong. Not arrogance, exactly. Arrogance is too loud, too obvious. This is something quieter and more dangerous. The settled, unquestioned certainty of a man who has built a career on being right and has never had occasion to doubt the foundations beneath him. Vice Admiral Sir Tom Phillips carried that certainty the way other men carry a watch, close to the body, consulted often, never questioned, and in the winter of 1941, it would sail with him out of Singapore Harbour and into the worst day in the history of the Royal Navy's Far East Command. Phillips was a small man, not simply short, though he was that, earning the nickname Tom Thumb from those who served around him, a name spoken sometimes with affection and sometimes with rather less, but compact in every dimension, as though everything about him had been pressed tight and made dense. He moved with precision, spoke with economy, and radiated a kind of compressed authority that a taller man might have achieved simply by occupying more space. Those who admired him described a razor mind, a gift for staff work, and an instinct for strategic argument that had carried him to the very highest levels of the Admiralty planning apparatus. Those who did not admire him described the same qualities and called them inflexibility. Both groups were largely correct. He was a man who had spent decades accumulating convictions, and convictions, by their nature, are not built to be surrendered. His career had run along the administrative and planning corridors of British naval power rather than the open sea. Phillips had accumulated something different: influence. He had spent long periods as a planner, as a deputy, as the kind of officer who shaped doctrine rather than tested it. And by the late 1930s, he was vice chief of the naval staff in London, sitting in rooms where the future of the fleet was debated and decided. He was, in almost every formal sense, one of the most powerful naval minds in Britain. What he was less certain to be was the right man for what was coming. The question of air power was not a new debate inside the Royal Navy by 1941. It had been argued, written about, wargamed, and quietly raged over for more than 2 decades. The growth of naval aviation, the demonstrated capacity of aircraft to threaten surface vessels, the hard evidence accumulating from conflicts in Spain, in China, in the early years of the European War, none of this had gone entirely unnoticed. But the institutional culture of the battleship navy was not a culture designed to receive unwelcome information gracefully. The big gun remained the central article of faith, the capital ship its cathedral, and the men who had climbed to the top of the naval hierarchy were, almost without exception, men who had shaped their professional identities around both. To accept fully that aircraft had made the battleship obsolete was not simply to change a tactical doctrine, it was to accept that the vessel you had devoted your career to mastering had been superseded. That is a heavy ask of any man, at any age. Phillips did not merely resist the argument. He prosecuted the opposing case with energy. He was, by the accounts of colleagues who sat across conference tables from him, a formidable debater who could marshal technical objections, historical precedents, and probability estimates into a case that was genuinely difficult to dismiss. His argument, broadly stated, was this: a properly armed and handled warship, with trained anti-aircraft crews and the freedom to maneuver at speed, presented a target that land-based aircraft could not reliably destroy. He pointed to the difficulty of hitting a moving ship from altitude. He questioned the accuracy of torpedo attacks against vessels capable of high-speed turns. He had seen wargame results that appeared to support him, and he had the standing to insist that those results be taken seriously. The problem was not that his arguments were entirely without foundation. The problem was that the world was moving past them, and he was not moving with it. The men who disagreed with Phillips were not a small or obscure group. Within the Admiralty and within the wider naval establishment, there were officers who had watched the evidence accumulate and drawn different conclusions. Officers who had seen what German and Italian aircraft had done to British vessels in the Mediterranean, who had studied what Japanese naval air power was doing to Chinese shipping, who understood that the mathematics of a torpedo arriving below the waterline were not the same as the mathematics of a bomb falling from altitude onto an armored deck. Some of them had said so, in memoranda and in meetings, in the careful language of men who understood the hierarchy and wished to remain within it. Some of them had said so rather less carefully and had paid for it professionally. Phillips was not the kind of man who took contradiction as useful information. He was the kind of man who took contradiction as a tactical problem to be defeated. This friction sharpened when Phillips was appointed to command Force Z. There were officers in Singapore, in the RAF, in the naval chain of command, who regarded the appointment with something between skepticism and dread. Not because they doubted his intelligence or his dedication, nobody seriously questioned either, but because they understood what his convictions meant in practical terms. A commander who believed that his ships could manage air attack would make decisions accordingly. He would sail without fighter escort if escort was inconvenient to arrange. He would push into contested waters when a more air-conscious officer might reconsider. He would weight the risk of air attack lower on his mental scale and weight his confidence in the ship's own defenses higher. And the ships, however formidable, were not built to substitute for the aerial protection that doctrine now recognized as essential. The concern was not abstract, it was a direct operational worry about what this particular man would do when things became difficult. There was also the matter of his relationship with the other services. Phillips's confidence in his own judgment extended, fairly naturally, to a certain impatience with those whose judgment differed from his. And in Singapore, that meant the RAF and its locally available fighter squadrons. The relationship between the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, at this stage of the war, was not uniformly warm. Institutional competition, resource arguments, and the still unresolved question of which service bore primary responsibility for maritime air defense had left deposits of friction throughout the command structure. Phillips had been a figure in those arguments at the highest level. He had opinions. He had won some of those arguments, and the result, in the specific theatre of Singapore in December 1941, was a naval commander who did not approach the question of air cooperation with the urgency it required, in a place where urgency was the only appropriate posture. It would be too simple to present Phillips as simply wrong-headed, a relic, a dinosaur, a man the war would expose. The reality is more complicated and, in some ways, more troubling. He was a product of a system. The doctrines he held, the priorities he carried, the blind spots that would prove fatal. None of these were his alone. They had been built into the Royal Navy's culture across decades of institutional habit, procurement choices, and a command structure that had consistently promoted the kind of thinking he embodied. Phillips had not invented the battleship navy's resistance to the air age. He had absorbed it, refined it, and risen through it, as any ambitious officer of his generation was effectively invited to do. The system that made him Vice Chief of Naval Staff was the same system that sent him to Singapore. The fault lines were structural. Phillips was simply the man standing on them when they gave way. What those who sailed with him recalled, in the accounts gathered afterward, was a commander who projected calm. Whatever his private calculations in those final days before Force Z sailed, The face he offered his officers and crew was composed, deliberate, and sure. He walked his ships as a man who believed in what he commanded and what he was doing with it. He did not perform doubt because he did not feel it, or if he did, he had buried it somewhere inaccessible, beneath layers of professional certainty deposited over a long career. For the men who saw him in those hours, that steadiness was reassuring. The nature of leadership often works exactly this way. The confidence of the man at the top flows downward, and for those below, it feels like safety. Only afterward, when the shape of the disaster became clear, did that same quality look like something else entirely. The fatal blind spot at the heart of Force Z was not a gap in intelligence, though intelligence was scarce. It was not primarily a failure of communications, though communications would fail repeatedly. It was a failure of imagination, lodged at the command level. A commander who could not fully conceive of what he had not yet experienced, and whose career had never forced that confrontation upon him. Other men in other commands, tested in the Mediterranean or in the waters around Norway, had learned with varying degrees of pain what aircraft could do to ships without adequate protection. Phillips had not been tested that way. He had been in the planning rooms. He had been winning arguments. And now, in the South China Sea, with 2 great ships behind him and no fighter cover above him, the argument was about to be settled by means that no conference table could accommodate. While British planners gazed confidently at their maps and argued over fleet deployments, another set of planners had been working in careful silence for the better part of a year. In the operations rooms of Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters, in the flight training grounds of southern Japan, and in the quietly expanding airfields of French Indochina, a vast and intricate machine had been assembling itself. It was not improvised, it was not reactive. It was one of the most elaborately coordinated offensive operations any naval power had ever attempted. A simultaneous strike across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle, timed to the hour, designed to shatter the Allied presence in Asia before a coherent response could be mounted. The men who built it understood something that their British and American counterparts had not yet fully absorbed, that the age of the battleship was ending, and the age of air power over open water had arrived. They had not merely theorized about this, they had trained for it, tested it, and were about to prove it. The architecture of the operation was breathtaking in its ambition. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, Wake Island, all were to be struck within hours of one another, or in some cases simultaneously. The planners in Tokyo understood that Allied strength in the Pacific and the Far East, if allowed to consolidate, would eventually overwhelm Japan's resources. The logic was stark. Strike hard enough, fast enough, and broadly enough to collapse the Allied defensive perimeter before it could stiffen. Buy the time needed to fortify a vast resource empire stretching from Malaya's rubber and tin down through the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. The operation demanded not merely courage, but extraordinary logistical precision, the synchronization of naval task forces, troop convoys, land-based air groups, and submarine screens across a theater of operations that stretched across roughly a quarter of the globe. That it came as close to running exactly as planned as it did remains one of the most sobering military achievements of the 20th century. At the heart of Japan's striking power in the Southern Theater was not the battleship or the cruiser, but the land-based aircraft. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent years developing its land-based naval air arm into a weapon of devastating precision, and the units assigned to the Malayan and Philippine campaigns represented the finest expression of that development. The crews who would go hunting for British warships in December of 1941 had been flying together for months, drilling not just the mechanics of flight, but the specific, brutally demanding techniques required to place a torpedo or a bomb onto a ship moving at speed through open water. These were not weekend exercises. The training was relentless, methodical, and often fatal. Pilots who could not meet the required standards were removed. Those who remained were among the most highly practiced naval aviators in the world. Torpedo attack against a warship is not a simple act. It demands that a pilot bring his aircraft in low, dangerously low, sometimes barely above wave height, hold a steady course, while every gun on the target ship is pointed directly at him, release the weapon at precisely the right moment, and then survive long enough to pull away, too early or too late, and the torpedo misses or runs shallow, too high, and the weapon breaks apart on impact with the water. The Japanese crews, training for the Southern Campaign, had studied the problem with the rigor of engineers. They practiced approach angles, release altitudes, and formations designed to split a ship's anti-aircraft fire by attacking from multiple directions at once. They refined the so-called anvil attack, a coordinated approach from several bearings simultaneously, designed to ensure that no matter which way a captain turned his ship, he was turning toward another incoming weapon. It was a doctrine built not on hope, but on accumulated hours of repetition. The bombers assigned to high-level attack faced a different set of challenges, but had trained with equal thoroughness. Hitting a moving ship from altitude requires the bomber crews to calculate the target's course, speed, and any change in direction the captain might make during the time the bomb is in the air. Japanese crews had trained extensively against moving target vessels, developing a feel for the geometry of the problem that went beyond textbook calculation. They flew in tight formations, designed to concentrate their bomb patterns, maximizing the probability that at least some weapons would find their mark. Their aircraft, the Mitsubishi G3M and the newer Mitsubishi G4M, had been designed from the outset for long-range overwater operations. Their range far exceeded anything equivalent in British or American service. From bases in southern Indochina, they could reach Singapore and the waters around Malaya with weapons still aboard. The British, for their part, had not seriously mapped the radius of that threat. Japan's intelligence picture of British strength in the region had been built carefully over several years. Japanese naval attachés, commercial contacts, and a network of observers across Southeast Asia had fed a steady stream of information back to Tokyo. By the autumn of 1941, the Japanese understood, in broad terms, what was at Singapore and what was not. They knew the RAF's Far East Command was equipped with aircraft well below the quality of frontline machines being held back for Europe. They knew the Army garrison, while large on paper, had not been prepared for a campaign fought through jungle from the north. They had tracked the construction of the Singapore naval base with considerable interest, and had noted, as any careful observer would, that its enormous dry docks and fuel reserves were oriented toward defending against a threat arriving by sea. That the threat would arrive by land and from the air had been a central assumption of Japanese planning from the beginning. When news of Force Z's departure from Britain and its progress towards Singapore began filtering through Japanese intelligence channels in late 1941, it was received with serious attention, but not alarm. Tokyo tracked the movement of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse with growing clarity as the ships passed through the Indian Ocean. The absence of an aircraft carrier from the group was noted and considered significant. A battleship without air cover was a different proposition entirely from a battleship screened by fighters. Japanese planners had built their entire offensive doctrine around the proposition that air power could neutralize surface ships, and here was a British admiral apparently sailing into their operational theatre without the one element that might have tested that proposition. The intelligence was shared with the commanders of the southern air groups. The ships were identified as priority targets if the opportunity arose. The command structure Japan had assembled for the southern operations was experienced and confident. The officers directing the air campaign had watched their torpedo and bomber crews train for months, and had no doubt about what those crews were capable of against unescorted capital ships. They had studied the results of exercises, reviewed the attack profiles, and satisfied themselves that the methods were sound. There was no complacency. The Japanese military culture of this period was not one that tolerated overconfidence in its planning phases, but there was a clear-eyed belief, grounded in evidence, that what they were about to attempt was achievable. The British belief that battleships were inherently safe from air attack at sea was a doctrine the Japanese intended to dismantle with arithmetic precision. What Tokyo could not know with certainty, as December approached, was exactly where British ships would be when the campaign opened. The sea is large and warships move. The plans therefore included reconnaissance protocols, long-range search aircraft that would sweep the waters south of Indochina and east of Malaya in the days following the initial landings, searching for exactly the kind of intervention that Force Z would eventually attempt. These reconnaissance missions were built into the operational schedule, not as an afterthought, but as a core element of the air campaign. The Japanese expected the British to react. They had planned for that reaction. They had prepared the means to answer it. The troop convoys assembling off the coast of southern Indochina in the first days of December carried the soldiers who would drive down the Malay Peninsula towards Singapore. They were protected by warships, but the planners understood that the most dangerous threat to those convoys was not a Japanese ship, but a British one. Specifically, the heavy guns of a capital ship arriving to scatter the landing force before it could get ashore. Preventing that intervention, or destroying the ships attempting it, was assigned to the land-based air groups. The torpedo crews in particular had been briefed on the possibility. They had trained for exactly this scenario. A fast-moving warship, probably zigzagging, probably with all anti-aircraft armament active, to be engaged at low level from multiple directions until it stopped moving. They had practiced until the procedure was no longer a plan but a reflex. Beyond the technical preparations lay something harder to quantify, but equally important: the conviction, shared across the Japanese naval air arm by this point, that the methods worked. Men who had spent a year drilling a technique and refining it through thousands of hours of training carry a different quality of confidence into battle than men who are attempting something for the first time. The Japanese aircrew who would eventually find Force Z in the South China Sea were not experimenting. They were executing a procedure they understood in their bones. On the other side of that equation, the men aboard Prince of Wales and Repulse were facing a form of attack, at a scale and with a coordination that their training and their doctrine had not anticipated. That asymmetry, not of courage, not of commitment, but of preparation, would determine everything that followed. There is a particular quality to the hours just before everything changes, a stillness that feels ordinary only in retrospect. On the evening of the 7th of December, 1941, Singapore was warm and humid and operating on something close to routine. Officers dined. Radio operators monitored their frequencies with professional patience. At the naval base on the northern edge of the island, men who had spent weeks living inside an atmosphere of tension had grown accustomed to it, the way you grow accustomed to a sound that never quite resolves. Prince of Wales and Repulse sat at anchor in the roads, their silhouettes familiar now to the dockyard workers who passed them each morning. They had been here only a matter of days, but already they had become a kind of furniture, large, reassuring, and seemingly permanent. The news, when it came, did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way catastrophic news often does, in fragments, each one confusing, each one requiring confirmation, each one worse than the last. Reports from Pearl Harbor crossed the Pacific and filtered eastward through relay stations and cipher rooms. And somewhere in the early hours of the 8th of December, Singapore time, the picture assembled itself with horrible clarity. The American Pacific Fleet's battleship row had been struck by wave after wave of Japanese carrier aircraft. Ships that had seemed when as permanent as buildings were sinking or already sunk. The attack had lasted roughly 2 hours. In that time, more than 2,000 American servicemen were dead, and the strategic architecture of the Pacific had been smashed open like a broken vault. For the men at the Singapore Naval Base who received that news in the small hours of the morning, the world they had been defending was a different place by the time the sun came up. What the news meant for Singapore specifically was not difficult to understand, even in those first stunned hours. The broad theory behind British strategy in the Far East had always rested on a chain of assumptions. America would remain a counterweight. Japan would not risk provoking two major powers simultaneously. The naval base would function as it was designed to function, a point of deterrence whose mere existence kept aggression in check. Pearl Harbor dissolved those assumptions one by one, and dissolved them at speed. Japan had not been deterred. Japan had struck first, and struck with a precision and violence that nobody in the comfortable planning offices of Whitehall had allowed themselves to fully credit. The question that now fell on Singapore's commanders was brutally simple. If Japan was willing to do that to the Americans, what was it planning to do here? The answer was already arriving, and it was arriving before anyone had finished processing the shock of Pearl Harbor. Even as reports from Hawaii were still being decoded and passed up the chain of command, a separate and equally alarming set of reports was coming in from the northeastern coast of Malaya. At Kota Baru, Japanese forces had begun landing in the darkness, soldiers wading ashore from transports, establishing a beachhead on British-controlled territory with ruthless efficiency. The landings at Kota Baru were, in fact, the very first Japanese amphibious operation of the Pacific War to make contact with defended shores, beginning marginally before the Pearl Harbor attack reached its peak. For Singapore's commanders, this was no longer a matter of intelligence assessments and worst-case scenarios. The war was here. It had arrived on Malaya's coast in the dark, and it was moving south. The atmosphere at the naval base shifted with a speed that surprised even those who lived through it. There was no moment of controlled, orderly transition, from peacetime procedure to wartime footing. There was simply the sudden, jagged recognition that everything had changed, and that the machinery of response had to begin turning immediately. Officers were summoned. Plans were retrieved from files. Communications crackled between Singapore, London, and the fleet. The base, which had been designed for precisely this kind of emergency, revealed immediately the gap between its design and its actual readiness. Air defense assets on the Malay Peninsula were stretched thin. The RAF's modern fighter strength in the region was nothing close to what had been promised when the strategic plan was written. And the one element that was conspicuously, powerfully present, two capital ships, was suddenly the most pressing variable of all. Vice Admiral Tom Phillips had been ashore on the evening of the Pearl Harbor attack, attending meetings in Manila with American naval commanders. He returned to Singapore in the early hours of the 8th of December, flying back into a situation that had transformed while he was in transit. He came back as a man who had spent the previous days attempting to coordinate with allies who were now themselves absorbing catastrophic losses. Whatever understanding he had built with his American counterparts was now subordinate to the immediate reality in front of him. Japanese forces were landing on Malayan soil, Japanese aircraft were operating from bases in southern Indochina, and Force Z, the two capital ships Churchill had sent as a show of strength, was sitting in Singapore harbour, waiting. The pressure to act was immense. The political logic of why the ships had been sent in the first place was now pushing toward a single conclusion. They had to be used. Phillips's deliberations in those hours were shaped by several competing forces. There was the strategic instinct, the sense that a powerful surface force could disrupt the Japanese landings at Kota Baru if it moved quickly enough, cutting supply lines, threatening transports, doing what capital ships were built to do. There was the intelligence picture, which was fragmentary at best. Japanese naval movements in the region were known only in broad outline, and the precise strength and location of enemy submarines and aircraft was unclear. And there was the air cover question, which had been hanging over Force Z since before it sailed. Phillips had requested fighter escort from the RAF's Air Vice Marshal in Singapore, and what he received was a confirmation that fighter cover could not be guaranteed, that the RAF's resources in the region were committed to the land battle now erupting along the Malayan Peninsula, and that providing sustained fighter protection for a naval sortie into the Gulf of Thailand was beyond what was currently available. The moment that confirmation arrived was, in retrospect, the hinge on which the entire disaster would turn. A different commander might have stopped there, might have concluded that operating capital ships without air cover, in waters where Japanese land-based aircraft had both the range and the numbers to reach them, was an unacceptable gamble. Phillips did not stop there. His faith in the ability of well-armed warships to defend themselves against air attack was not a casual assumption. It was a deeply held professional conviction, shaped by decades of naval thinking that had consistently underestimated what aircraft could do to ships at sea. He had seen the arguments. He had heard the advocates of air power within the Admiralty. He had not been persuaded. And now, with Japanese soldiers on Malayan beaches, and the political weight of two capital ships pressing down on him, he moved toward action. What is important to understand is that Phillips was not reckless in any crude sense. He was not indifferent to risk. He was operating within a framework of assumptions that had been validated repeatedly by the institutions he served. Assumptions that would be proven catastrophically wrong, not in theory, but in blood, in the open sea, in a matter of days. He believed, and there were many who agreed with him, that the Royal Navy's anti-aircraft armament had reached a point where a determined ship could fight off air attack, particularly from high-level bombing. Torpedo attack from aircraft was a more complex concern, but there too, a fast-maneuvering warship with a capable crew was not considered a helpless target. These were not lunatic beliefs. They were the consensus of an institution that had not yet had its consensus broken. Pearl Harbor might have broken it, if anyone had had the time to absorb Pearl Harbor fully. But Pearl Harbor was hours old, and the landings at Kota Baru were happening now. Throughout the 8th of December, as news of the Japanese offensive spread across the entire Pacific and Southeast Asian theater simultaneously, the Singapore naval base operated in a state of urgent controlled movement. Stores were loaded. Fuel was taken on. The destroyers assigned to escort Force Z, 4 of them in total, were brought to readiness. Signals passed between Phillips and London, Phillips and the RAF, Phillips and the commanders on the Malayan Peninsula, trying to hold Kota Baru against an enemy who had arrived with considerable force. The situation on land was deteriorating faster than anyone had publicly admitted. The Japanese were not merely probing, they were pushing, and they had the resources and the doctrine to keep pushing. By the evening of the 8th of December, Phillips had made his decision. Force Z would sail. The sortie would be conducted under radio silence, to preserve the element of surprise. which meant Phillips would be cutting himself off from updated intelligence once the ships put to sea. The plan, such as it was to move north through the South China Sea, strike at the Japanese transports and landing forces off Kota Baru, and withdraw before Japanese air power could organize a concentrated response. It was a plan built on compressed timings, uncertain intelligence, and the hope that speed and surprise could substitute for the fighter cover that was not coming. Whether Phillips himself entertained doubts in those final hours before sailing is not recorded with any precision. What is recorded is that he assembled his force, issued his orders, and prepared to take two of Britain's most powerful warships into waters where the enemy was already watching. The men aboard Prince of Wales and Repulse received the news of Pearl Harbor the way fighting men receive most news, absorbing it, processing it, fitting it into the immediate reality of their own situation. Some felt the scale of it, the sense that the world had lurched onto a different track and that nothing would be the same. Others focused narrowly on what it meant for them, for their ships, for the orders that would surely follow. There was, by all accounts, no panic. There was instead the particular quietness of men who understood that the situation was serious, and who had been trained to meet serious situations with steadiness. The hours ahead would test that steadiness, in ways that none of them, on the evening of the 8th of December, could fully imagine. The ships would sail the following night. The South China Sea was waiting, and somewhere to the north, on airfields cut from the jungle of southern Indochina, aircraft were already being armed and briefed for missions that would rewrite the history of naval warfare. In the gathering darkness of the 8th of December 1941, Singapore's naval base hummed with a peculiar mixture of urgency and secrecy. The news of Pearl Harbor had arrived like a thunderclap less than 24 hours earlier, and now the calculation that had seemed stable only yesterday had collapsed entirely. Vice Admiral Tom Phillips stood in his quarters aboard HMS Prince of Wales, weighing a decision that would define the final hours of his life. The Japanese had begun their assault on Malaya that same morning, landing troops at Kota Baru on the northeast coast of the peninsula, and reports spoke of Japanese naval forces pressing southward through the waters that Britain had long considered its domain. To do nothing was to invite the loss of Malaya itself. To act was to risk the only capital ships now standing between Tokyo's ambitions and the conquest of the entire Far East. Phillips chose to act. The orders went out quietly, deliberately stripped of the fanfare that such a deployment might once have commanded. This was not a voyage designed to reassure the population or announce Britain's strength to the world. Instead, it was cloaked in operational security, so tight that even some officers at the base did not immediately grasp what was unfolding. Force Z would sail that evening. HMS Prince of Wales, her brand new hull still bearing the scars of her ferocious engagement with Bismarck in the Denmark Strait 8 months earlier. HMS Repulse, the battlecruiser whose sleek lines and reputation for speed had made her beloved throughout the Royal Navy for nearly 2 decades, and 4 destroyers, HMS Tenacious, HMS Electra, HMS Express, and HMS Vampire, the last a vessel of the Royal Australian Navy. Together, they represented the visible embodiment of naval power in the Far East, the physical manifestation of Churchill's gamble that mere presence could deter Japanese aggression. Now, they were going to sea not as a deterrent, but as a fighting force, without knowing whether they would return. The preparations that afternoon were methodical and absorbing, the kind of shipboard routine that occupied men's minds and hands, but could not fully quieten the undercurrent of apprehension. Ammunition was checked and rechecked. Anti-aircraft gunners stood their watches, running through the motions of drills they had practiced 1,000 times, but suddenly understood in a different light. Supply officers ensured that medical stores were distributed, that food sufficient for an operation of indeterminate length was loaded aboard, that every system was as ready as human care could make it. The crews of both capital ships were aware that they were embarking on something consequential, though the full weight of it had not yet settled on many minds. Some men wrote letters that afternoon, letters they sealed and left behind with instructions that these words reach home only in certain circumstances. Others simply moved through their duties with the quiet focus that experience and training provided. The professional discipline of the Royal Navy, honed across centuries and deployed in 1,000 different circumstances, asserted itself even as the ground beneath everything shifted. The question of air cover had been resolved, if one could call such a grim resolution a resolution at all. Phillips had requested RAF fighter escort for the operation, a basic precaution that seemed elementary given everything that had been learned about air power in 2 years of war. The RAF's response came back quickly. No fighters could be spared. The Japanese air offensive against Malaya was now in full motion. Every available aircraft was needed for the defense of the peninsula, and the airfields from which fighters could operate were already under pressure or had been overrun. The mathematics of air superiority were ruthless. With no clouds to hide in, no friendly fighters overhead, and Japanese air bases now fully alert to British naval activity, Force Z would be sailing into waters where the sky itself might become an enemy. Phillips accepted this reality without illusion about what it meant. He had voiced his skepticism about the threat posed by aircraft attacking warships at sea, a conviction shaped by his long career and the historical record as he understood it. But he was not reckless, merely unwilling to abandon Malaya without an attempt to defend it. The decision to proceed without air cover was made with eyes open, even if those eyes were not seeing everything that lay ahead. The question of radio silence hung over the deliberations in the hours before departure. Phillips's orders from the Admiralty were explicit. Maintain strict wireless silence. Do not transmit anything that might betray Force C's position or movements to Japanese intelligence. This was standard operational security, the kind of precaution that had served the Royal Navy well in countless engagements. The logic was sound. Japanese ships and aircraft were actively searching these waters. Every radio transmission was a beacon that might guide them to their target. Yet silence carried its own cost. Phillips would be operating with the intelligence that had been provided to him at the moment of departure, unable to ask for updates, unable to confirm or deny the reports that reached him through other channels. He would be cut off from the wider picture, dependent on his own assessments, and such information as could reach him through his destroyers or chance encounters. It was a classic military dilemma. The security of silence weighed against the vulnerability of ignorance. Phillips accepted the constraint without knowing how utterly it would hobble him in the hours to come. The board aboard Prince of Wales, as evening fell, was one of controlled tension. She was the newer ship, the modern battleship, that represented the cutting edge of British naval design. Her crew carried a particular pride, the sense of being entrusted with something new and untested and vital. Officers moved through their preparations with the quiet formality that convention demanded, but conversations in the wardroom carried an undertone of gravity. This was not a routine patrol or a training exercise. The reports coming through official channels and informal gossip alike painted a picture of Japanese forces pressing forward with surprising speed and coordination. The older hands among the officers, those who had served in previous wars or studied naval history, knew that the 19th century confidence in the invulnerability of big ships was long dead. They had seen what air power could do at places like Taranto and off Crete. They knew that the Bismarck, which Prince of Wales herself had fought, had been crippled and ultimately sunk, not by enemy battleships, but by torpedo aircraft. And yet the orders were to sail, and sail they would. Aboard HMS Repulse, the atmosphere carried a different character. She was older, a throwback to an earlier age of naval warfare, yet her crew held her with deep affection. Her captain, William Tennant, was a figure of considerable experience and steady judgment, respected throughout the service. The men who crewed her anti-aircraft guns knew that their effectiveness would be tested in ways they had only imagined. Her speed was her greatest asset, the ability to maneuver and evade that had served battle cruisers since their creation in an earlier era. Yet Repulse was also smaller and less heavily armored than a true battleship, making her inherently more vulnerable to the kind of concentrated attack that air power could deliver. The crew understood this, though perhaps not in all its implications. They knew their ship was fast, and they knew she had a fighting tradition to uphold. That would have to be enough. The loading of supplies and ammunition continued through the afternoon, a process that seemed to stretch endlessly because every moment brought new reports, and every report required new consideration. How many days would the operation last? Where would they likely encounter Japanese forces? Should ammunition be distributed for a single major engagement or for an extended campaign? The questions multiplied and could only be answered through guesswork and past experience. The 4 destroyers that would accompany the capital ships were small compared to their charges, but each carried its own crew and its own responsibility. The commanding officers of those vessels knew that their primary duty was to provide protection to the battleship and battlecruiser, to position themselves as shields against attacks from any quarter. It was a role that had been clearly defined in countless exercises and that would now face its ultimate test. As darkness fell completely and the time for departure approached, the crews assembled in their stations. Officers conducted final inspections, moving through compartments and gun positions with systematic attention, checking that every man was in place, that every system was functioning, that nothing had been overlooked. The searchlights on the harbor installations cut through the darkness as they sometimes did during peacetime exercises, though nothing in Singapore that night carried the character of peacetime anymore. The Japanese were ashore on the peninsula. Their aircraft were overhead or very near, and the war that had seemed distant and manageable just hours before had become immediate and threatening. The crews of Force Z were going to sea knowing this, understanding it not just as an intellectual fact, but as something that changed the weight and texture of everything they were doing. At approximately 1735 hours in the evening of the 8th of December, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, accompanied by their destroyer screen, began to move away from the buoys where they had been secured. The engines that had been tested and retested began to turn over, sending vibrations through the hulls that men felt in their bones. The lines that held these great vessels to the land were cast off, and slowly, with the deliberate precision that naval protocol demanded, the ships began to move. The harbor, that had been their sanctuary since their arrival, was receding behind them, and ahead lay waters that were rapidly becoming a battlefield. No bands played, no crowds cheered from the dock. There was no ceremony to mark the occasion, no pageantry that would have been natural in an earlier age when naval forces departed on missions of such consequence. Instead, there was the quiet purposefulness of professional sailors embarking on an operation in which everything remained to be determined and nothing could be taken for granted. The waters of the Johore Strait were calm that evening, the darkness complete, the stars visible overhead in a sky that gave no indication of the violence about to erupt beneath it. The ships moved in formation, the capital ships at the center, and the destroyers positioned on their flanks and ahead, alert for any sign of enemy activity. Radio silence held firm. The men aboard each vessel were alone with their thoughts, with the sound of the engines, with the knowledge that they were moving towards something that none of them could fully predict or control. Some slept, others remained alert in their stations, watching and listening and waiting. Officers reviewed their battle plans, understanding that these arrangements on paper would be rendered obsolete the moment actual contact with the enemy occurred, yet needing to have something to hold to, some framework upon which to hang their decisions when chaos arrived. The old certainties about capital ships and their invulnerability, certainties that had seemed absolute just days before, now seemed like relics of an earlier war. The decision to proceed without air cover had been made, accepted, and now Force Z was committed to it. Phillips had chosen to act, to risk these vessels in an attempt to contain the Japanese offensive. Churchill's gamble, that mere naval presence would deter Japanese aggression, had already proven to be a profound miscalculation, rendered obsolete by the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now the ships themselves were going to test whether air power or sea power held dominance in this new kind of warfare. The crews moving through their duties aboard Prince of Wales and Repulse that evening carried with them the certainties of their training and their experience, the confidence built from service in what had been, until very recently, a naval force that faced no rivals in the Far East. They could not know, as they settled into their stations for the night, that barely more than 36 hours separated them from the moment when those certainties would be utterly destroyed, when everything they believed about the nature of naval warfare would be tested against a form of attack for which they had no adequate defense. They sailed into the dark with professional discipline and courage. That would have to suffice. It would not be enough. In the modern age of instantaneous communication, we take for granted the ability to know what is happening halfway across the world within seconds. We carry devices in our pockets that connect us to billions of others, that plot our position to within a few meters, that stream video and data across continents faster than sound travels through air. It is almost impossible to imagine a time when knowing where an enemy fleet was positioned could be a question without an answer, when critical intelligence could be lost to chance, to human error, to the simple friction of distance and delay. Yet on the morning of the 9th of December 1941, Vice Admiral Tom Phillips was commanding a British fleet while operating in precisely that condition. He was sailing blind, and he did not fully know it. The tragedy that would unfold over the next 48 hours was not inevitable, but it was made far more likely by a cascade of missed signals, broken chains of communication, and crucial information that arrived either too late or not at all. This is the story of how those failures compounded, and how they sealed the fate of two great ships. The first critical break in the chain came from beneath the waves. On the 8th of December, 1941, as Force Z was making its way northward to engage the Japanese landings at Kota Baru, a British submarine was patrolling the waters off the coast of Malaya. Her crew detected the presence of Japanese warships in the area, enemy capital ships, the kind of vessels that would fundamentally change the calculation for an admiral already operating with incomplete information. The sighting was reported, as protocol demanded, but the message took time to reach Singapore. By the time it arrived at the naval base, it had already been overtaken by events. Phillips did not receive it, or rather, if he did receive some version of it, the information did not carry enough weight or clarity to change his operational decisions. The submarine crew had done their duty, but their warning arrived into a void where no one was listening quite intently enough. It was the first strand in a web of missed intelligence, and it would not be the last. The second strand involved the Japanese themselves. Japanese air and naval forces were searching for Force Z with considerable urgency and sophistication. They had been tracking British movements in the region, monitoring radio traffic when they could, and deploying reconnaissance aircraft in expanding search patterns across the South China Sea. On the morning of the 10th of December, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, the kind of long-range floatplane that could loiter for hours over open ocean, located Force Z, proceeding northward at what appeared to be high speed. The pilot saw the two capital ships, saw the escorting destroyers, saw everything an admiral in Tokyo would desperately want to know. But in that moment, a critical failure occurred. The sighting report, once transmitted, became confused in the chain of Japanese naval communications. Some accounts suggest the report was delayed. Others indicate it was initially misread, or its significance underestimated. What is certain is that the Japanese command, despite their superior intelligence apparatus and their predetermined intention to attack Force Z, did not immediately act on this crucial information with the speed and coordination they might otherwise have displayed. The British admiral's greatest vulnerability, his lack of knowledge of where Japanese air bases actually were and how close they really were, remained intact, at least for the moment. But there was a third failure, perhaps the most consequential of all, and this one lay squarely with Phillips himself, a commander at sea who is operating in enemy waters, who is aware that enemy air power exists somewhere in the region, who knows that he is sailing without adequate air cover, faces a critical choice: maintain radio silence to avoid giving away his position, or maintain contact with headquarters and with reconnaissance assets to know what is happening around him. Phillips chose silence. It was a choice rooted in the traditions of naval warfare, in the doctrine that a fleet without radio protection was a fleet that could be tracked and destroyed by direction-finding equipment. It was also a choice made by a man who had already convinced himself of something deeply dangerous, that his two capital ships, moving at high speed through open ocean, could evade attack by air, could survive the worst that enemy aircraft could throw at them, could accomplish their mission, and return to Singapore unscathed. The radio silence that Phillips imposed meant that even as Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were reporting his position, even as Japanese air crews were being briefed on their targets, even as a coordinated assault was being assembled, Phillips had no way to request updated intelligence from Singapore, no way to ask if contact had been made with enemy forces, no way to know that the intelligence picture had fundamentally changed since he had sailed out of the base 2 days earlier. What intelligence Phillips did possess was being managed through a system that was itself fragmentary and incomplete. Singapore's Naval Intelligence Section was tracking Japanese movements as best they could with the resources available to them, but the picture they held was not comprehensive. They knew that Japanese forces were landing on the Malay Peninsula, but they did not know with precision where all of the Japanese air bases actually were, or how many aircraft they contained, or how quickly those aircraft could be mobilized and launched. British Air Force intelligence was similarly incomplete. The RAF in Malaya was fighting for its life against a numerically superior and tactically advanced Japanese Air Force. Collecting intelligence about enemy dispositions was taking a distant second place to the immediate struggle for survival in the air. Reconnaissance flights were being flown, but the results were fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. No one in Singapore had a clear, real-time picture of where Japanese bombers and torpedo aircraft were stationed, how many of them there were, or what their search patterns actually were. Phillips was not receiving that information, because that information did not exist in any reliable form. But what he should have known, what he might have deduced from the information that was available, was that Japanese air power in the region was far more extensive and far better coordinated than his own assumptions suggested. The geographical reality added another layer to the intelligence failure. The Japanese air bases in Indochina, in what is now Vietnam, were not thousands of miles away from Force Z's projected course. They were, in fact, considerably closer than Phillips seemed to appreciate. A Japanese bomber flying from a base in Indochina could reach the waters where Force Z was operating, carry out an attack, and return to base to refuel and rearm. The search time, the approach time, the time available for the British sailors to mount an effective defense, all of these were compressed far more tightly than Phillips's operational planning appeared to account for. The intelligence about this critical fact, about the range of Japanese aircraft, about the location of Japanese bases, about the vulnerability window that existed when Force Z was in those particular waters, either was not compiled into a coherent picture or was compiled in such a way that Phillips did not fully absorb its implications. There is a particular kind of blindness that affects commanders who are cut off from reliable information. It is not stupidity. It is not cowardice. It is a cognitive trap into which highly intelligent, highly trained, and deeply experienced men can fall. When a commander lacks information, he must make assumptions. When those assumptions align with what he wants to believe, with his conviction in the superiority of his ships, with his confidence in his own abilities, with his trained skepticism toward an emerging threat like air power, those assumptions solidify into something that feels almost like knowledge. Phillips had assumed that his ships could operate without air cover because he believed capital ships were inherently robust against air attack. He had assumed he could sail into waters without knowing precisely where the enemy was because he believed his ships were fast enough to evade anything that came toward them. He had assumed he could maintain radio silence without incurring excessive risk because he believed the benefits of secrecy outweighed the costs of operating blind. None of these assumptions were unreasonable in isolation. Taken together, and in the context of an incomplete intelligence picture, they created a scenario in which a commander was sailing toward danger without adequate knowledge of how close that danger actually was. The missed intelligence also operated at the level of human friction and timing. Messages were sent from Singapore, but they did not always reach Force Z. Radio conditions in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea could be unreliable. Coding and decoding of classified messages consumed time. The chain of command that would have normally ensured that critical intelligence reached a fleet commander was disrupted by the stress of the battle for Malaya, by the fact that multiple headquarters were fighting for resources and attention, by the simple reality that in the early days of the war in the Far East, the British military apparatus was struggling to process the speed and scale of the Japanese offensive. A message that said Force Z should be aware that Japanese aircraft have been spotted in a particular area, a message that might have caused Phillips to reconsider his course, or to request air cover, or to reduce his exposure, was either not sent, was sent and not received, or was sent and not understood to be a high-priority warning. By the morning of the 10th of December, 1941, the trap was tightening. Force Z had been diverted toward Kuantan by the false report of Japanese landings, a diversion that was taking them not away from Japanese air bases, but steadily closer to them. The reconnaissance aircraft that had spotted them on the previous day was returning to its base, its sighting report finally being processed and acted upon in Tokyo. Japanese bomber and torpedo aircraft, having received their briefing and their target coordinates, were beginning to take off from their bases in Indochina, and Phillips, aboard his flagship, had no real-time knowledge of any of this. He did not know that his position had been reported. He did not know that attack aircraft were being launched toward his coordinates. He did not know that the window of time in which his ships could escape unscathed was closing not in hours, but in minutes. The intelligence that might have warned him, that might have changed his decisions, that might have saved his ships, existed somewhere in the vast system of British military command. But it had not reached him. It was fragmented, delayed, misread, and lost in the gaps between one command headquarters and another, between sender and receiver, between knowledge and the moment when that knowledge could be acted upon. What made this failure of intelligence particularly tragic was that it was not inevitable. The information existed. The submarine crew had seen Japanese ships. The Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had found Force Z. The intelligence sections in Singapore had compiled fragments of a picture that, if properly analyzed and communicated, would have revealed the danger. The RAF knew, at least in broad terms, where Japanese air bases were located and roughly how many aircraft they contained. But none of this intelligence reached Phillips in a form that was clear enough, urgent enough, and timely enough to alter his course. The British naval command structure, under stress, fragmenting under the pressure of fighting on multiple fronts, failed to ensure that a man commanding capital ships in enemy waters received the information he needed to keep those ships alive. In war, such failures are often fatal. That was about to become brutally, irreversibly clear. Chapter 9. The False Report and the Fateful Turn. In the early hours of the 10th of December, 1941, as Force Z cut through the warm waters of the South China Sea, Vice Admiral Phillips faced a decision that would unfold across the next 12 hours with the relentless momentum of a trap closing around him. The two capital ships and their 4 destroyer escorts had been at sea for less than 24 hours, steaming northward in carefully maintained radio silence to avoid detection. The morning brought a message that would shatter the fragile logic Phillips had constructed to justify the mission. A report of Japanese landings at Kuantan, on the east coast of Malaya, some 120 kilometers to the south and west of Force Z's current position. The signal came through encrypted and urgent, and to Phillips, it suggested an opportunity to strike at the enemy before they consolidated their beachhead. What Phillips did not know, what he had no way of knowing, through no fault of his own, was that this report was false. It was not a fabrication born of panic, but rather a misidentification and a tragic accident of misrouting that would prove fatal. The news, once it reached the Admiral's flag bridge, seemed to justify everything. His decision to sail without air cover, his gamble that speed and the cover of darkness could carry his ships through dangerous waters, his belief that a powerful show of force could still turn the tide in Southeast Asia. The mechanics of how this false report reached Phillips reveal one of the most catastrophic communication failures of the entire naval campaign in the Far East. British military intelligence in Malaya had not originated the message itself. Instead, it had been compiled and relayed from multiple sources that were themselves incomplete, contradictory, or simply wrong. Signals from the Malay Peninsula suggested that Japanese troops had come ashore or were attempting to land, but the exact location remained unclear in the fog of the opening hours of the invasion. The information officer responsible for passing this intelligence to the Naval Command had to make a judgment call about which report to prioritize and forward to the fleet. Under pressure, facing the overwhelming cascade of enemy activity across Malaya, this officer selected one piece of information among many, the report of a landing at Kuantan, and transmitted it as verified intelligence to Admiral Phillips aboard Prince of Wales. The fundamental problem was that no one in the chain of transmission had the time or the certainty to confirm whether the landing at Kuantan was real or a misidentification of activity elsewhere on the coast. In the confusion of the first hours of the Japanese invasion, accuracy had surrendered to speed. The message reached Phillips not as a tentative possibility, but as an actionable report, and he treated it accordingly. For an admiral, operating without air reconnaissance, without reliable intelligence from shore-based observers, and with his radio networks compromised by the need for silence. The report of a Japanese landing presented both a dilemma and an opportunity. Phillips's original plan had been to strike the Japanese transport fleet and covering warships somewhere off Singora in Thailand, to the north and east of Malaya, and then to withdraw, with his force intact, back towards Singapore. But the Kuantan report suggested that the Japanese were not content with their landings in the north. They were making a second major assault effort on the east coast of Malaya itself. From a strategic perspective, Kuantan was closer to Singapore than Singora was, and it lay roughly along the route that Force Z would eventually have to travel to return home. If Japanese troops were landing there, they would threaten the entire rear area and the railroad network that supplied the British defences across Malaya. Phillips's calculations, constrained by incomplete information and the pressure of command, shifted toward the south. He would turn Force Z toward Kuantan, investigate the report, and if Japanese landing craft were present, he would attack them while they were still vulnerable and concentrated in the anchorage. The Admiral signaled his destroyers to alter course. Prince of Wales and Repulse swung southward into waters that were every hour bringing them closer to Japanese air bases in Indochina, a calculation that Phillips's own staff would later suggest he did not fully appreciate. The voyage toward Kuantan consumed the bulk of the 10th of December, and it consumed something far more precious than hours. It consumed distance, sea room, and daylight. As Force Z approached the coast, the morning haze and cloud cover that had provided some concealment began to break apart. Phillips stationed reconnaissance aircraft from Repulse to scout the approaches to Kuantan and report back what landing activity could be seen from the air. The Japanese had prepared no landing at Kuantan. When the Repulse flying boat arrived over the anchorage on the morning of the 10th, the pilot reported back that the harbour was empty of enemy shipping. No transports, no landing craft, no covering warships. The report that had drawn Force Z southward was a phantom. Some hours were lost as Phillips digested this information and considered his options. He had steamed closer to danger based on faulty intelligence, and now he had to decide whether to continue northward towards Singora after all, or to reverse course and withdraw back towards Singapore. Neither choice was attractive, and both were becoming riskier as the day progressed. The morning hours had burned away. The window of darkness that had seemed to offer Force Z safety was closing. The Admiral remained on the flag bridge, calm and composed in his bearing, but the constraints of his situation were tightening. At around mid-morning, Phillips received an update from the air reconnaissance. A British scout aircraft reported seeing what appeared to be Japanese destroyers moving south from Singora on a course that would bring them toward Force Z's position. This sighting seemed to offer Phillips another opportunity for combat, and he began to maneuver to intercept whatever enemy forces were moving down the coast toward him. The Admiral's decision to pursue this contact kept Force Z moving in open water for several more hours in broad daylight, and crucially, it kept the fleet operating in areas where Japanese aircraft, based in southern Indochina, were increasingly likely to establish visual contact. The weather, too, was turning against Force Z. The cloud cover that had persisted through the night had begun to clear as the morning advanced into midday. Phillips found himself commanding a force of capital ships in nearly perfect visibility, steaming southward at high speed, with no air cover overhead and no nearby British fighters to call upon if enemy aircraft appeared. The RAF had confirmed before the sortie that it could not provide continuous fighter escort, and those squadrons of Buffaloes and Brewsters that might have offered some protection remained at airfields around Singapore, hundreds of kilometers away, and out of range of Force Z's position. The fateful element of this mid-morning period was the arrival of a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft at nearly the same moment that Phillips was maneuvering in response to the destroyer sighting. A Japanese float plane, one of several aircraft that had been tasked with sweeping the waters around Malaya in search of British naval assets, came over the horizon and spotted Force Z in the open water. What should have been an immediate and crushing advantage for the Japanese search operation nearly became nothing. The pilot of the reconnaissance aircraft had been searching for hours without success, and his fuel was running low. Had he not spotted the two battleships and their escorting destroyers on his final sweep before returning to base, Force Z would have remained undiscovered for perhaps another few hours. But the pilot's eyes found their target. The reconnaissance aircraft wheeled away before any anti-aircraft fire could reach it, and the pilot sent an urgent signal back to his base, detailing the position, course, and composition of the British fleet. The message was garbled in transmission, and there was a critical delay before the report reached the strike forces that had been standing by on airfields in Indochina. Nevertheless, the signal got through. The location of Force Z was no longer a matter of guess and search. It was fixed, reported, and available to Japanese commanders who were preparing to launch their morning airstrikes. The loss of stealth at this precise moment cannot be overstated in its strategic consequence. Vice Admiral Phillips had sailed from Singapore with the understanding that his best advantage lay in speed and the cover of night and weather. He had accepted the risk of operating without fighter cover, partly because he believed he could move through the danger zone quickly enough to avoid being caught in the open water during daylight hours. The diversion to Kuantan, followed by the search for the reported destroyer contact, had consumed precisely the hours that Force Z could least afford to lose. When the reconnaissance aircraft returned to its base and transmitted the signal giving away the fleet's position, Phillips's window of survival had already begun to close. The Admiral did not know at that moment that he had been spotted. His radio remained silent to preserve the secrecy that he still hoped might protect his force. He could not know that Japanese strike aircraft were already being scrambled from bases in Indochina, that the coordinates were being plotted, that the engines of bombers and torpedo aircraft were being warmed for a mission that many of those pilots believed would be impossible under normal circumstances. The attack on heavily defended capital ships in open water in the full light of day. But circumstances, as they often do in warfare, had tilted decisively against the defender. The hours between the sighting of Force Z and the arrival of the Japanese airstrike seem in hindsight to have unfolded with the precision of a clock winding down. Phillips, unaware that he had been detected, continued to probe the coast and search for the elusive Japanese destroyer contact that may or may not have existed in the form he believed. The false report of the landing at Kuantan, which had drawn him southward, and the uncertain destroyer sighting, which had kept him searching rather than withdrawing, had combined to position Force Z in a place and at a time where it was most vulnerable. The captain of Prince of Wales and the officers of the fleet maintained their stations and their readiness, but they were operating on the assumption that they would encounter enemy forces gradually and at a time of their own choosing. The reality that was about to unfold would shatter that assumption with violent and overwhelming suddenness. The sky above the South China Sea remained largely clear, with only scattered cloud and broken weather to offer any concealment. Force Z was as exposed as any major warship could be. The Admiral kept his ships moving, kept his anti-aircraft crews at their stations, and maintained the watch. But there was no longer any advantage to be gained from stealth or darkness. The 10th of December had advanced from dawn toward noon, and with each passing hour, the threat from the air grew more imminent and more real. Phillips and his officers could not see the Japanese aircraft approaching from the north, could not measure the closing distance, could not know precisely when the moment would arrive, when the sky would suddenly become hostile, and every gun, every piece of armor, and every ounce of seamanship would be tested to the absolute limit. What no one aboard Force Z could have predicted, despite the reasonable military planning that had preceded the sortie, was the sheer scale and coordination of the Japanese air response that was already in motion. The Japanese Naval General Staff had devoted extraordinary resources to planning airstrikes against British capital ships, and the pilots and crews of the Naval Air Arm had undergone intensive training in torpedo attacks and coordinated bombing runs against moving targets at sea. The machines being prepared on the airfields of Indochina included both high-altitude bombers, armed with armor-piercing bombs, and specialized torpedo aircraft that had been drilled extensively in the specific challenge of sinking heavily defended warships. The Japanese commander overseeing the strike operations understood that the absence of British fighter cover represented a genuine and historic opportunity. In the normal course of events, attempting to sink a modern battleship defended by its own anti-aircraft armament and protected by fighter aircraft would have been a near-suicidal proposition even for disciplined and well-trained naval aviators. But the circumstances that had delivered Force Z into Japanese hands, the false report, the lost hours, the clear weather, the absence of RAF fighters, had created a set of conditions that would almost never occur again in this war. Japanese officers and pilots began to understand, as the reconnaissance report was analyzed and the strike forces were briefed, that they were being given an opportunity to strike a blow against the Royal Navy that would reverberate across the entire world. The moment when Force Z finally became aware that it was no longer alone in the waters around them was drawing near, and it would come not with warning, but with the sudden appearance of aircraft in the sky, approaching from multiple directions and at multiple altitudes, far more numerous and far better coordinated than any British officer aboard either capital ship had expected to encounter. Admiral Phillips stood on the flag bridge of Prince of Wales, a small man in body, but carrying the enormous weight of command and the responsibility for the lives of thousands of men under his orders. He could not have known that he had already been found, that the hours remaining before the Japanese strike arrived could be counted not in multiples, but in fractions. The false report had guided him into the trap. The lost time had allowed the Japanese to ready their forces. The clear weather had stripped away his concealment, and now, in the final hours before the engagement began, Phillips faced only the normal uncertainty of command at sea in wartime, the weight of decisions made, the doubt about whether his calculations had been correct, and the waiting that always precedes combat. The sea remained calm and blue beneath the South China Sea sky, and Force Z pressed onward into the morning, its fate already written in the coordinates that the Japanese reconnaissance pilot had sent racing back to the airfields in Indochina. On the morning of the 10th of December, 1941, the airfields of southern Indochina stirred with the peculiar energy of men preparing for battle they have been trained relentlessly to execute. The Japanese naval air forces operating from bases near Saigon and Cam Ranh Bay had spent months conducting precision exercises in the attack formations they would now deploy in earnest. Their target remained unknown to the individual pilots until minutes before takeoff, but the nature of the mission was unmistakable: hunt and destroy the British capital ships known to be operating in Malayan waters. The weather forecast, meticulously gathered by Japanese meteorological officers, indicated clear skies over the Gulf and the coastal regions where the British were believed to be operating. The pilots received their final briefings in low-lit hangars, where squadron commanders outlined the search patterns, the attack procedures, and the radio protocols that would bind together the coordinated assault. The atmosphere was one of confidence married to the discipline of warriors who understood that training alone would not guarantee success against ships bristling with anti-aircraft guns and manned by experienced naval gunners. Around them, ground crews made their final preparations, checking fuel lines, loading ammunition belts into the wings of torpedo bombers, arming the explosive ordnance that would be delivered with surgical precision. The morning held that quality of manufactured inevitability that descends upon military operations once the decision to strike has been irrevocably made. The striking force assembled was substantially larger than Admiral Yamamoto's Pearl Harbor operation, in terms of the specific asset mix devoted to ship killing. The Japanese had concentrated upon the development of naval air doctrine that treated the sinking of warships as a specialized discipline, distinct from general bombing operations. Their arsenal included high-level bombers, Type 97 aircraft, which would deliver bombs from altitude in patterns designed to overwhelm anti-aircraft defenses through sheer volume and coordination. But the true cutting edge of their striking power lay in their torpedo bombers, the Type 91 aircraft, twin-engine machines that carried the 24-inch torpedo, a weapon that had proven devastatingly effective against stationary and slow-moving targets during the long years of the China campaign. The torpedo crews had trained obsessively in the peculiar challenges of their trade, delivering their weapons from low altitude at precisely calculated approach speeds, in formation, against targets that would be desperately maneuvering to evade them. The bombers and torpedo aircraft operated in a carefully choreographed sequence. The high-level bombers would attack first, drawing the anti-aircraft fire and forcing the target ships to maneuver, expending ammunition and disrupting formation. Then the torpedo bombers would press in from multiple angles, giving the British gunners impossible choices about which threat to prioritize. It was a doctrine that had been refined through practical experience, and the crews who carried it forward moved with the confidence of specialists executing their craft. The search phase of the operation extended across many hours of flight time, with Japanese aircraft operating in expanding geometric patterns across the Gulf and the approaches to Malaya. The pilots knew the general area where the British ships were believed to be operating, but the vastness of the ocean presented an enormous search problem. Reconnaissance aircraft, already airborne before dawn, had been assigned the task of locating Force Z and transmitting the precise position back to the striking force once contact was established. The tension inherent in this phase was not often discussed in the official accounts, but it was nevertheless real. The possibility existed that the search would yield nothing, that the British ships would remain hidden or would have moved beyond the anticipated search box, leaving the striking force to return to base, with fuel running low and the mission uncompleted. The pilots maintained their formations at prescribed altitudes, scanning the waters below with the focused intensity of hunters who have been given a specific prey to locate. The hours wore on, and in many of the aircraft, doubt began to creep into the minds of men who had been told that the British capital ships were in the area, but who saw only empty ocean and the brown smudge of the Malayan coastline in the distance. The radio discipline was absolute. No chatter, no unauthorized transmissions, nothing that might give away the presence of the striking force to British listening posts. The formation leaders knew that fuel was becoming a consideration. They could not search forever, and a decision point was approaching where the operation might have to be abandoned. It was in these circumstances of growing uncertainty that the final reconnaissance sweep was initiated, a last attempt to locate the target before the fuel situation forced a withdrawal. The reconnaissance pilots, already flying for hours, continued their systematic search pattern with the methodical persistence that defined their training. The morning had passed into the early afternoon, and the sun was climbing toward its apex, when one of these searching aircraft, flying at a lower altitude than the main striking force, caught sight of something that transformed the entire operation from a hunt into an engagement. The report crackled through the radio network. The British ships had been sighted, their position fixed, their course and speed estimated. The information cascaded through the formations of waiting bombers and torpedo aircraft, transmitted in the careful, coded language of military radio procedure. What had seemed like it might become an abortive operation, the wasted fuel, the hours of searching, the return to base without achieving the objective, suddenly crystallized into a concrete tactical problem with a solution that lay within the grasp of the assembled crews. The pilots adjusted their course toward the coordinates provided by the reconnaissance aircraft. The formations tightened, and the focus that had been diffused across a vast search area now concentrated like light through a lens onto the precise position where two British battleships steamed in open water, unaware of what was approaching from the north. The approach phase carried its own peculiar tension, a final period of minutes during which everything that could go wrong might still prevent the attack from being executed as planned. The Japanese pilots maintained their formations and their altitude, rising gradually as they drew near to their target, to gain the advantage of height that would be crucial for the opening phase of the assault. Below them, though they could not yet see it clearly, Force Z continued on its course. The British officers and crews aboard the Prince of Wales and Repulse, still unaware of the gathering threat that was bearing down upon them. The Japanese pilots had been briefed extensively on the characteristics of the ships they were about to attack. The Prince of Wales, a modern battleship with powerful anti-aircraft armament, relatively new, equipped with modern fire control systems that would be formidable opponents. The Repulse, older, faster, a battle cruiser rather than a true battleship, equipped with long-range anti-aircraft guns of respectable caliber. Both ships possessed the capability to inflict serious damage on their attackers, and the Japanese pilots carried with them a realistic understanding of the risks they were about to assume. There was no assumption of invulnerability, no casual confidence that the attack would be answered with anything other than determined and skillful resistance. The Japanese Naval Air Force had learned, through hard experience in China and elsewhere, that capital ships did not surrender their destruction cheaply, and that the losses inflicted on attackers could be substantial, even when the attacked ships ultimately sank. The first bombers began their attack approaches as the distance closed to what the Japanese considered optimal bombing range. The high-level bombers, the Type 97 aircraft, broke formation and began their runs at the British ships, releasing their ordnance in the patterns that had been so carefully rehearsed on the practice ranges of Indochina. The anti-aircraft guns of the British ships opened fire almost immediately, sending up the flak patterns that the bombers had anticipated, but which nevertheless represented genuine danger to the tightly formed flying machines that were delivering their bombs. The first explosions on and around the British ships erupted as the bombs found their marks or fell close enough to cause damage through blast effect. The anti-aircraft barrage was formidable, the British gunners responding with the speed and volume of fire that came from long experience and well-trained crews. Japanese bombers were hit and damaged, some smoking badly as they attempted to complete their attacks and then climb away from the defensive fire. The battle that would ultimately result in the sinking of both British capital ships had begun in earnest, and the pilots pressing their attacks forward did so with the knowledge that they had achieved their primary objective. They had found their target, and they were now engaged in the combat for which months of training had prepared them. The transition from the bombing phase to the torpedo phase represented one of the most delicate choreographic elements of the entire operation. The torpedo bombers had to press forward as the high-level bombers withdrew, presenting themselves as targets to the already alerted and hostile anti-aircraft defenses, but with the crucial advantage that they now had a target that was compelled to maneuver in response to the immediate threat of the bombs falling around it. The torpedo bombers came in low, their pilots concentrating with absolute intensity on the approach course, the airspeed, the altitude, the precise moment at which the torpedo would be released to have the maximum probability of reaching the target and detonating against the hull of one of the British ships. The distance separating the approaching torpedo bombers from the British anti-aircraft guns closed with terrifying rapidity, the relative velocity of the aircraft and the ships creating a temporal compression that reduced the actual engagement time to mere seconds from the pilot's perspective. The defenders fired with the intensity of men who understood that they were under direct attack, and that their own survival depended upon their ability to destroy the aircraft before the torpedoes could be released. Some of the torpedo bombers were hit, their aerodynamic trim disrupted by damage. Some of them lost before they could complete their attack runs. Others pressed through to the release point, pickled off their torpedoes, and attempted to claw their way to altitude and safety as they withdrew from the area of the British anti-aircraft fire. The torpedoes, released at the precise moment and altitude calculated to give them the optimal trajectory toward the target ships, began their underwater runs toward the British hulls, leaving trails of bubbles in their wake as they ran true toward their targets. The Prince of Wales, in her position as the lead ship of Force Z, bore the brunt of this coordinated assault in its initial phases. The sequence of events that unfolded across the next several minutes would determine not merely the outcome of the battle, but the entire strategic situation in the Far East. The Japanese pilots, executing the doctrine they had been trained to employ, directed their attacks toward the largest and most modern of the two targets, understanding that the destruction of the newest battleship in the British fleet would constitute the greatest possible psychological and strategic achievement. The focus of the assault was concentrated, methodical, and overwhelming in its coordination. Bombs and torpedoes streaked toward the British ship, the pilots maintaining their discipline, even as they saw anti-aircraft fire, claiming some of their comrades' aircraft, and flashing across the sky in the frantic barrage of the British gunners, attempting to preserve their ship. The outcome of this phase of the action would be determined by factors of chance, of damage control capability, of the precise placement of hits and near misses, and of the performance of the machinery and materials that had been built into these great ships during construction in the yards of Scotland and elsewhere. The Japanese pilots had done their part. They had found the target. They had attacked with coordination and skill, and they had delivered their weapons toward the British capital ships with the precision and courage that their training and discipline could provide. What happened next lay beyond their control, dependent upon the physics of explosion and flooding, upon the skill and bravery of the British sailors attempting to save their ships, and upon the accumulated design choices that had been made years before when the Prince of Wales had been laid down in the shipyards on the Clyde. The morning of the 10th of December, 1941, broke clear and hot across the South China Sea. Force Z had been at sea for less than 2 days, and the crews of Prince of Wales and Repulse were settling into the rhythm of their mission, scanning the horizon, maintaining formation, and listening to the constant chatter of orders and reports that filled every compartment. The men had no way of knowing that Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had already found them, that the trap was closing, or that within hours the waters around their ships would become a graveyard. At approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, the first alarm bells began to sound. Lookouts aboard Repulse spotted aircraft approaching from the northwest, dark shapes moving across the brilliant sky in tight formation. The call went up through the ship's tannoy system, and every man who could hurried to his action station. Anti-aircraft gun crews scrambled to their weapons, loaders thrust shells into chambers, and rangefinders locked onto the approaching bombers. There was a moment, just before the first bombs fell, when the war suddenly became real, in a way that training exercises and distant reports could never prepare you for. The roar of engines overhead was unlike anything most of the crew had heard before, a deep, mechanical thunder that seemed to shake the very air around the ship. Repulse was commanded by Captain William Tennant, a man with more than 30 years of naval service and a reputation for cool judgment under pressure. He had spent much of his career studying and refining the art of ship handling, the precise angles and speeds and timing that could make a capital ship dance across the water like something far smaller and more nimble. As the first wave of Japanese high-level bombers descended through the sky, releasing their ordnance in a coordinated assault, Tennant made the decision that would define the next hours of his command. He would not sit and absorb the punishment. Instead, he would use every ounce of Repulse's speed and maneuverability to evade the falling bombs. The ship heeled hard to starboard, her engines straining at full power, and the water beneath her hull began to churn white with the violence of her acceleration. The first bombs missed, sending up massive columns of seawater, perhaps 100 meters from the ship's port side. The spray that fell across her decks was warm and acrid with the smell of explosives. Tennant's decision had worked. The ship had moved, and death had passed harmlessly by. But everyone aboard knew that this reprieve was only temporary. There would be more attacks. There would be more waves. The Japanese attackers, numbering somewhere between 80 and 100 aircraft in total, came in successive waves throughout the morning and into the afternoon. The first assault consisted primarily of high-level bombers dropping their loads from altitude, twin-engined Mitsubishi bombers that flew in disciplined formations and released their ordnance in patterns designed to bracket their targets. Against these attacks, the anti-aircraft guns of both Force Z ships opened fire with a ferocity that shook the air. The Bofors guns, the 2-pounder pom-poms, and the heavier 8-inch and 4-inch main battery pieces all roared to life in a coordinated defense that produced a wall of flak and exploding shells across the sky. The Japanese bombers, coming from high altitude, were hard to hit, and the British gunners struggled to lead their targets correctly. Still, they tried, and the violent chatter of the guns became the heartbeat of the battle. On Repulse, the gun crews worked with mechanical precision, loading, firing, reloading, firing again, driven by the ancient instinct of men who understood that their survival might depend on their rate of fire. The noise was apocalyptic. The vibration from the guns running at full power made the entire ship tremble. Spent shell casings clattered across the deck in cascades of gleaming brass, and the acrid smoke from the firing hung thick in the humid tropical air. Captain Tennant, his tactical eye sharp and his hands firm on the ship's helm, kept Repulse moving through every attack. When he saw the Japanese bombers beginning their diving runs, he would order a violent course change, and the battlecruiser would respond with a kind of desperate grace. The massive ship, weighing more than 30,000 tons and nearly 700 feet in length, should not have been able to move like this, should not have possessed the agility of a destroyer or a cruiser. But Tennant's decades of experience allowed him to predict the fall of the bombs and to maneuver his vessel away from the calculated impact points just as the explosives were releasing. The first hours of the battle became a study in ship handling and timing that would later be remembered and discussed in naval academies. One after another, the bomb patterns fell into the water around Repulse, and one after another, the ship slipped away from them. The men aboard could see the tremendous splashes as the bombs hit the water, columns of water, perhaps 150 feet high, and they could hear the wind of their passing. But the bombs did not strike home. It was, in those early hours, a display of extraordinary seamanship. Prince of Wales, sailing roughly 700 meters behind and to starboard of Repulse, was also maneuvering to avoid the attacks. Her crews were performing with equal competence, and her anti-aircraft armament was every bit as heavy as Repulse's. But Prince of Wales was new, less experienced in ship handling, and her captain had to contend not only with the immediate demands of battle, but with the knowledge that Admiral Phillips was aboard, watching, assessing, carrying the weight of the entire operation's success or failure on his shoulders. As the morning progressed and the attacks continued, a growing realization began to spread through the minds of the British officers. This was not a sporadic assault from aircraft that had happened to find them. This was coordinated, relentless, and it was not going to stop. The Japanese had clearly planned this attack beforehand, had trained extensively for it, and had brought overwhelming numbers to bear. Wave after wave of bombers came down through the sky, and when they had expended their ordnance and turned away, other aircraft would appear on the horizon. Torpedo bombers, sleek and dangerous, approaching at wave-top height to deliver their devastating payload. The men began to understand that they were not facing an air attack in the sense that they had been trained to understand it. They were facing a complete integrated assault, combining high-level bombing, dive bombing, and torpedo attack. The Japanese had studied the challenge of attacking capital ships from the air, and they had developed a methodology that was proving devastatingly effective. Every time Repulse evaded one group of attackers, another group was already moving into position. Every time Prince of Wales's guns drove one formation away, another was beginning its approach. The depth and persistence of the assault was something new, something that revealed how fundamentally the nature of naval warfare had changed in the 3 years since the war had begun. The men aboard Repulse were beginning to feel the peculiar exhaustion that comes from sustained combat. The adrenaline that had carried them through the first attack had begun to fade, replaced by a cold, grinding tension and the physical exhaustion of manning the guns. The temperature on the gun decks, packed with machinery and ammunition handlers, and the heat radiating from the gun barrels, had become overwhelming. Men were soaked in sweat, their faces streaked with soot and cordite residue, their ears ringing from the constant thunder of the firing. The anti-aircraft gun crews had been at their posts for hours now, loading and firing and reloading in a mechanical cycle that had become almost hypnotic. Some men had begun to feel the first touch of fear beneath the routine of their duties, a creeping awareness that no amount of speed and maneuverability might be enough if the Japanese persisted long enough. The gun captains continued to call out corrections and adjustments, trying to lead their targets, trying to place their shells in the path of the attacking aircraft. A few Japanese aircraft were falling, smoke trailing from their fuselages, their formations breaking apart as damaged machines began their descent toward the sea. But the majority kept coming. On the bridge of Repulse, Captain Tennant maintained his focus with an almost supernatural calm. His orders came precisely and clearly, his helm orders sharp and direct, calling for the violent course changes that continued, hour after hour, to pull the ship away from the falling bombs. Other officers and ratings watched him with a growing sense of respect and confidence. Here was a man who had trained for this moment for decades, who understood the physics of the sea and the dynamics of a moving ship under fire, and who was using every ounce of that knowledge to keep his command afloat and fighting. The gun crews began to notice that when the captain ordered a turn, The bombs always seemed to fall just astern, or just ahead, but never on the ship itself. It was as if he could predict the exact moment of release and adjust course accordingly. Word began to spread through the ship's communication systems. The captain is handling her perfectly. The captain knows what he is doing. We are going to survive this. That whispered affirmation passed from compartment to compartment through the tannoy, and from man to man through eye contact and gesture, became as important as the anti-aircraft fire itself. Morale, which could easily have begun to crumble under the sustained assault, remained steady because the men had faith in their command. And yet, as the morning stretched toward noon, and as the attacks continued with undiminished intensity, the fundamental mathematics of the situation began to work against the defenders. There were only so many shells in the magazines, only so much fuel in the tanks that powered the engines, only so much human endurance that could be drawn from men who had been under constant stress for hours. The Japanese attackers had no such limitations. They could keep coming, wave after wave, fresh pilots and fresh aircraft rotating through the skies above Force Z. The anti-aircraft gunners could not hit everything. The speed and maneuverability of the ships could not evade every bomb and every torpedo. The longer the battle continued, the greater the likelihood that eventually one of the attacking aircraft would find its mark. The laws of probability were working against the British. Every evasion, every near miss, every successful defense only bought time. It could not change the fundamental imbalance between the attacking force and the defending force. Some of the more experienced officers, particularly those who had been following the development of naval air power over the previous decades, were beginning to understand that they were witnessing the end of an era. The age of the battleship, as the supreme instrument of naval power, was ending not with some grand declaration, but in the humid air above the South China Sea, with Japanese bombers and torpedo aircraft pressing home their attacks against two British capital ships that, for all their armor and their guns and their speed, could not escape the assault coming from the skies. Prince of Wales, like Repulse, was maneuvering vigorously to avoid the attacks, her crews performing with competence and courage. But Prince of Wales was different from Repulse in subtle ways that would prove decisive in the hours to come. She was newer, which was an advantage in terms of her firepower and her systems, but it was also a disadvantage when it came to the practical experience of her command. Admiral Phillips was aboard, which meant that the captain of Prince of Wales had to balance his own tactical decisions against the presence of the commanding officer of the entire operation. The ship had suffered damage to her hull and her systems during her recent action with Bismarck, damage that, while repaired, meant that some of her systems were not functioning with complete reliability. And most importantly, though no one yet understood how important this would become, Prince of Wales was not handled by her captain with quite the same degree of aggressive maneuvering that Tennant was employing with Repulse. Tennant was keeping his ship in almost constant violent motion, turning sharply and frequently to change course and throw off the targeting calculations of the bomber pilots. The captain of Prince of Wales was more conservative, making fewer and smaller course changes, perhaps conscious that Admiral Phillips was watching from the bridge, perhaps conscious of the navigational dangers of pushing a brand new battleship too hard, perhaps simply operating according to a different tactical philosophy than the one that Tennant was employing. By early afternoon, the attacks that had begun in the late morning were showing no sign of abating. The Japanese bombers and torpedo aircraft kept coming, their formations rotating through the skies above Force Z, with a persistence that was starting to border on the supernatural. The men aboard both ships were operating in a state of heightened tension and exhaustion that was becoming difficult to sustain. The gun crews were beginning to show the first signs of fatigue, slightly slower loading times, slightly less precise aiming, a kind of mechanical quality to their movements that suggested that they were running on reserves of endurance rather than on fresh strength. The engine rooms of both ships were operating at full power, the turbines roaring and straining, the engineers and stokers working with sweat streaming down their faces to keep the boilers fed and the propellers turning. The water temperature was already rising from the friction of such sustained high-speed operation. Some of the machinery was beginning to show signs of stress, and all the while, the Japanese kept coming. Captain Tennant continued to maneuver Repulse with extraordinary skill, and the battle cruiser continued to evade the attacks. But eventually, in the way that all human endeavors must confront the limits of human capability and the indifference of chance, the law of probability would demand its payment. The ship could not dance forever. The gunners could not hit everything. The attacks would not end. And in the moments still to come, in the hours that stretched ahead, as the afternoon wore on, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, those immutable laws would begin their work. For now, in these early hours of the battle, Repulse was still afloat, still fighting, still evading. Captain Tennant was still at his post, still maneuvering, still commanding. His ship was still whole, but the first blood was being drawn from the waters around Force C, and the true test, the moment when superior seamanship and courage would confront the overwhelming weight of coordinated air power, was still to come. In the opening minutes of the air assault on Force C, Prince of Wales carried a weight that history rarely grants to any single warship. She was still brand new, her hull unpainted in places, her crew learning the patterns of her machinery through action rather than training. At 11:30 in the morning, on the 10th of December 1941, she was the most powerful weapon Britain had in the Far East. A battleship of 35,000 tons, armed with 10 14-inch guns, her superstructure bristling with anti-aircraft batteries, designed to fill the sky with steel and fire. Yet newness was also vulnerability. Her crew had not yet lived through the rhythm of real battle together. The ship's officers understood her theoretically. They did not yet understand her temperament under extremity. That gap between design and reality was about to close in the most brutal way possible. The Japanese torpedo bombers came in wave after wave, and the gunners aboard Prince of Wales responded with everything they had. The noise alone, the crash and roar of the anti-aircraft armament, the barking of the pom-poms, the rattle of machine gun fire, created a dome of sound that made it nearly impossible for men to hear orders. But noise and volume of fire are not the same as accuracy against fast-moving aircraft, and the Japanese pilots knew how to press their attacks. They came in low, taking the flak, absorbing it, pushing forward until the moment of release, and then the first torpedo struck. It hit Prince of Wales on her starboard side, below the waterline, approximately abreast of the bridge. The explosion was not so much heard as felt, a deep, bone-shaking concussion that traveled through the entire length of the ship, and in that fraction of a second, the mathematics of Force Z changed forever. The impact punched a hole in her hull, but the damage went far deeper than the visible wound. The torpedo's warhead detonated in a catastrophic sequence that flooded her starboard propeller shaft tunnel. Water poured in, not a trickle that damage control parties might have managed, but a torrent that sealed spaces, drowned machinery, and cascaded through compartments faster than the crew could counteract it. More critically, the explosion severed or jammed the port rudder, the main rudder that controlled the ship's steering. In an instant, Prince of Wales transformed from a maneuverable battleship into something far more helpless. She could still move forward, her engines still had power, but her ability to turn, to twist away from further attacks, to present her bow or stern to incoming fire, was crippled. She could steam in a line, that was almost all. Officers in the damage control center worked with the desperate precision that warship crews bring to such moments, moving through flooded passages, assessing compartments, fighting to isolate the damage and prevent it from spreading further. But heroic effort alone cannot overcome the laws of physics. The rudder jams had been struck so thoroughly that no amount of pulling or coaxing could free them. The engineering teams realized, with growing certainty, that they would not restore full steering capability. What they had was a ship that could inch forward, could maintain basic propulsion, but could not dance. And in an air attack, a battleship that cannot dance is a condemned battleship. Prince of Wales had been in action for perhaps 10 minutes. She had absorbed one torpedo hit. The engagement was only just beginning. Yet she fought on. The gun crews remained at their stations. The anti-aircraft batteries continued to throw up walls of fire, and the officers throughout the ship tried to maintain discipline and fighting efficiency in the face of mounting disaster. More Japanese aircraft came in, wave after wave, and Prince of Wales's gunners managed to claim some kills. Japanese aircraft did fall, burning and tumbling into the sea, but the sheer weight of the assault was overwhelming, and the mathematics of naval air warfare were merciless. The Japanese bombers and torpedo planes were trained, coordinated, and numerous. A battleship, no matter how powerfully armed, cannot defend itself in all directions simultaneously. It cannot be everywhere at once. An aircraft can. Multiple aircraft can. And they did. A second torpedo struck, and then a third, coming in from different angles, hitting her hull in succession. Each impact added to the flooding, deepened the list to starboard, and progressively suffocated the ship's ability to fight back. The anti-aircraft armament began to fail in cascades as power conduits were severed or flooded, cutting the electrical feeds that drove the gun turrets. Weapons that had been chattering and roaring fell silent, not from choice, but from the simple fact that the ship's nervous system was being systematically destroyed. Officers reported to the bridge that such and such a battery was no longer responding. The fire control radar was out. The main steering still would not respond. Below decks, in engine rooms that were growing increasingly hot and hostile, engineering officers watched their gauges and made the calculations they dreaded. The water was rising. It was rising faster than they could pump it out. Prince of Wales was dying, though she did not yet know it. She was sinking, slowly, but visibly, and with the inexorable certainty of any large steel structure once the sea has decided to reclaim it. The ship began to list more noticeably to starboard, and that list, once it began, fed on itself. Compartments that had been above the waterline slipped below it. The weight of the water, already aboard, pulled the stern up and the bow down, changing the angle of her hull relative to the sea. Senior officers made the calls that senior officers have to make in such circumstances. Secure this compartment, abandon that one, retreat to here, hold the line there. It was like managing a burning building while standing on the building itself, knowing that at some point, the entire structure would either sink or right itself. It would not right itself. They all knew it. The decision came from Admiral Phillips himself. The flagship would attempt to limp toward Kuantan, or toward the coast, or toward any position where damage control might have a fighting chance, or where the crew could be evacuated in shallower water. Prince of Wales tried to move, but even basic maneuvers were now agony. She could not turn effectively. The best she could do was attempt to proceed in some direction that might give her a chance. But the Japanese attacks showed no sign of slackening. If anything, as the morning wore on, more aircraft came, and the assault became more concentrated. It was as though every Japanese bomber and torpedo aircraft within range of the South China Sea had been given the same target and the same orders. And in a sense, they had been. Prince of Wales was the objective. She was the symbol. Sink the battleship, and everything that follows becomes possible. The crew of Prince of Wales, distributed throughout the ship in dozens of compartments, each sealed against the rising water, could not see the full picture of their vessel's fate. They only knew what their immediate surroundings told them. In the engine rooms, the men could feel the shuddering, the vibration of the ship as she was hit, and the growing angle as she began to heel over. In the turrets, the gun crews could sense that power was fading, that the turrets were sluggish to respond, that something fundamental had shifted in the ship's capacity to defend herself. In the damage control parties, the sailors pushed water back with pumps and piping, sealed doors behind them, and worked in the knowledge that their labor was almost certainly futile, that they were fighting against an inevitability, but they fought anyway, because that is what crews do when trained under the traditions of the Royal Navy. You fight until you are told to stop. You do not consider the larger mathematics. You do your duty in your assigned space. By mid-morning, Prince of Wales was wounded so severely that movement itself became dangerous. The flooded compartments had accumulated such weight that the ship's structural integrity was in genuine question. Officers were aware that she might not sink vertically, but might instead capsize, that the list could continue, and the ship could roll over entirely, which would mean a different kind of death for men below decks who had nowhere to escape to. The decision was made to change course, to try to beach her in shallower water, or to find some position where she could at least rest on the bottom with part of her superstructure above water. It was a desperate calculation, but then everything at this point was desperate. Prince of Wales, the newest British battleship, the ship that had fought the Bismarck only months before, was now attempting to find water shallow enough to save her from sinking entirely. The Japanese did not relent. They attacked her position repeatedly, adding to the damage that was already catastrophic, and ensuring that whatever chance remained was rapidly closing. The list continued to increase. The bow continued to sink lower into the water, and the men who remained aboard, the officers directing the abandonment, the engine room crews still at their posts, the damage control parties, who knew there was nothing left to control, understood that they were reaching the final calculation. At some point very soon, the ship would go under. The only question was how many men would be aboard when it did, and how many could be saved by the destroyers that were desperately attempting to pick them up from the water. Prince of Wales had been under attack for roughly an hour. In that time, she had absorbed multiple torpedo hits, suffered catastrophic damage to her rudder and steering, flooded vast portions of her interior, and lost the ability to maneuver or defend herself effectively. She had gone from a modern capital ship, the embodiment of British naval power in the Far East, to a near-stationary wreck whose fundamental architecture was being progressively violated by water and physics. One well-placed hit had started the cascade. The others had merely confirmed it. She would not survive the morning. The only battleship Britain had managed to deploy to the Pacific was already lost. The question now was not whether she would sink, but when, and what would happen to her crew when she did. Throughout the morning of the 10th of December, Repulse had been the ship that would not die. Where Prince of Wales had been struck early and rendered helpless, the aging battlecruiser had danced through the attack with a skill that seemed almost impossible. A survivor's grace, born from decades of service, and the steady nerve of her command. Captain William Tennant stood on her bridge, watching the sky, calculating distances and angles with the precision of a man who had spent his entire career learning to read the language of naval warfare. His orders to the helm came crisp and clear, and Repulse responded. Starboard, port, full ahead. The ship wheeled and twisted like a creature twice her age had no right to do. Bombs fell and missed. Torpedoes churned through water that should have held her, but she was gone before they arrived. The crew, watching from their stations, felt the strange exhilaration of men who were winning when they should have been losing, who were still alive when the mathematics of the engagement said they should not be. But exhilaration is a fragile thing in war, and mathematics, however defied, does not change. By mid-afternoon, after hours of sustained assault, Repulse had expended something more precious than ammunition. She had expended luck. The Japanese pilots, learning from their failures, were adjusting their tactics. The waves of attack were no longer scattered and probing. They were becoming coordinated, deliberately overwhelming. The men aboard Repulse could see it in the pattern of the aircraft approaching, could hear it in the intensity of the anti-aircraft fire that needed to be more desperate, because the targets were coming faster and from more angles at once. The ship's complement of 4-inch guns hammered away. The pom-poms clattered in their mounts. Lewis guns rattled with a sound like wet cloth tearing. Smoke rose from the gun positions, and beneath that smoke, men fed ammunition in a rhythm that had become almost automatic, almost mechanical, because to think about what came next was to stop moving, and stopping meant dying. When the concentrated attack came, it came with the weight of inevitability. Multiple torpedo aircraft converged on Repulse from different bearings, a maneuver that made evasion of every attacker mathematically impossible. Tennant saw it unfold, saw the impossibility of it, and in that moment made the calculation that a captain makes when he understands his ship is lost. The torpedoes struck in rapid succession, hitting the starboard side of the battlecruiser with explosions that did not make the sound that those aboard expected. They were heavy, dull thuds that seemed to come from the very heart of the ship, felt in the bones of men standing on the bridge half a mile away. The first impact threw men from their feet across the deck. The second came seconds later, then the third. The lights went out, not gradually, but all at once, plunging the interior spaces into darkness, broken only by the emergency lighting that cast everything in a strange, sickly amber that made the chaos seem dreamlike and present at the same time. Repulse began to list almost immediately, the water pouring in through the ruptured hull at a rate that the damage control parties could do nothing to arrest. Men who had spent hours at their battle stations, who had done their duty and asked no more of life than to serve their ship, now found themselves scrambling in darkness toward companionways that were tilting at angles that made climbing them like scaling a cliff. The water was rising, cold and black, and absolutely indifferent to the lives it would take. In the engine rooms, in the boiler rooms, in the spaces far below the waterline where men had worked in heat and noise and vibration, the realization came with sudden, terrible clarity. Orders had to be passed verbally because the communications systems were failing. Men shouting down darkened tunnels to tell others that they needed to abandon their posts, to get out, to move toward the ladder that led to the deck above, the deck that might still be above water when they got there. On the bridge, Captain Tennant watched his ship die. There was no other way to describe it. Repulse was not simply sinking, she was rolling onto her side as the water accumulated on one flank and the ship lost her ability to fight the pull of gravity and physics and the laws of the sea that had guided naval officers since the age of sail. He gave the order that a captain gives when he has done all that he can, when his crew has performed beyond what any nation had the right to expect, when further resistance would mean nothing but waste. Abandon ship. The words were passed through whatever communication systems still functioned, were shouted across decks that were increasingly vertical, were transmitted to men in compartments that were flooding as they heard them. The order that a captain gives only once, and that carries with it the weight of all the failures and all the successes of his command. The men of Repulse responded with discipline that seemed almost superhuman. There was no panic in the modern sense, no screaming mob, no rush to the lifeboats that would have worsened everything. Instead, there was an almost formal procession toward the exits, a queuing in the face of death that spoke to training, to the bonds that men form with each other, to something in the character of those who wear the uniform. The ship's gunnery officer, Major John Alastair Mackintosh, stood near the companionway as the list increased, helping men through the narrow passages, making certain that no one was being left behind who could possibly be reached. Other officers did the same, sometimes literally holding back sailors who wanted to rush, keeping order, maintaining the thin line between escape and catastrophe. Quartermaster George Fakes, a man who had served in the Navy through the 1920s and the 1930s, found himself helping a young rating who had frozen in fear, urging him along, speaking to him as though they were simply taking a stroll, rather than racing against the advance of the sea. By now, the destroyer Electra, which had been shadowing Repulse throughout the engagement, moved in closer to take men from the water. The speed at which the battlecruiser was going down accelerated as the water met the internal structure of the ship, as the stability that had kept her afloat for so long finally gave way to the weight and pressure of the ocean. The final moments were swift. Those who had jumped, or who had been forced to jump, as the deck became vertical, found themselves suddenly thrust into water that was thick with oil, that was churned and disturbed by the violence of the sinking. The wreck of Repulse rolled, and as it rolled, men who had been standing on what had been her hull suddenly found themselves sinking with her, pulled down by the suction of the water, by the weight of the dying ship, by forces far greater than their own strength and will. But there were destroyers, Electra, Vampire, and the others, their crews working with desperate efficiency to pull men from the water, to throw ropes and scramble nets over the side, to grab hands and pull bodies aboard, even as their own ships raced the risk of being attacked in turn. The water in which the men were floating was not clean. It was thick with oil from Repulse's ruptured bunkers, a black, suffocating substance that coated skin and filled mouths and made breathing difficult even for those who had survived the fall. The survivors clung to wreckage, to planking, to anything that would float. Some stayed together, groups of men who had served in the same compartment, who knew each other's names, who had shared the experience of the attack, and now shared the experience of survival. Others were alone, isolated in the vast, indifferent expanse of the South China Sea. The destroyers moved among them, their crews demonstrating the same discipline and efficiency as the men they were rescuing. Nets were thrown, ropes were secured, men were hauled up the sides of warships never designed to be rescue vessels, to be hospitals, to bear the weight of so many survivors at once. The sea was still being searched by Japanese aircraft, and the destroyers could not linger. They had to move, had to respond to new threats, had to protect what they had already saved before they could save any more. Captain Tennant was among those who entered the water, his uniform torn and stained, his dignity intact, because dignity is something that cannot be taken by any circumstance of war. He was picked up by Vampire, pulled from the oil-thick water and brought aboard, where he watched as his ship, the ship he had commanded, the ship whose crew had fought with such extraordinary courage, ceased to exist. She had sunk so quickly that many of those who had been aboard her were still in the immediate vicinity, still calling out, still struggling against the oil and the cold and the knowledge that their ship was gone. The destroyer crews, already operating at the absolute limit of what their small ships could accommodate, made decision after decision about who to pull up next, about where to position themselves, about how to maximize the number of lives saved against the absolute certainty that they could not save them all. The numbers of those who died aboard Repulse would never be known with certainty. The estimates ranged, but somewhere in the range of 800 men were lost. Crew members who had been in compartments that flooded too quickly, who were trapped below decks, who were pulled under by the suction of the sinking, who found the oil-slicked water too much to bear, and who surrendered to it. Against this were arrayed more than 700 who were saved, men who owed their lives to the discipline of their own conduct, to the orders of their officers, and to the desperate courage of the destroyer crews who risked their own ships to pull survivors from the sea. In the statistics of warfare, in the mathematics of disaster, this was no small thing. The proportion of survivors to the total complement was higher than it might have been, and that difference had been purchased with the determination that officers and men would maintain their courage and their order even in the final moments. The destroyers moved away from the wreck, moving toward Prince of Wales, where another battle was approaching its climax. The men pulled from Repulse were wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared, were given water and biscuits from emergency rations, were tended by medical personnel who had suddenly found themselves caring for far more casualties than they had space for. Some men wept, some sat in stunned silence, their minds struggling to catch up with the speed of events. Others immediately began asking about friends, about officers, about whether anyone had seen particular men or heard any word of what had become of them. The destroyers were crowded beyond any reasonable limit, their decks slippery with oil, their companionways choked with wet, injured, shocked men who were alive because their ship had sunk and because others had risked their lives to bring them out of the water. Behind them, the South China Sea closed over the place where Repulse had been. The battlecruiser that had spent decades at the forefront of British naval power, that had carried the flag of empire across the world, that had survived the earlier part of this very attack through the skill and courage of her captain and crew, slipped beneath the surface and became, in an instant, a grave. No ships of that class would ever be built again. No battlecruiser would ever again take a place in a battle line. The era that Repulse had represented, the age of the armored ship, the capital ship that could deliver broadsides and rule the waves, was ending, though few understood it in that moment. Those who had served aboard her, who had watched her fight, who had escaped the rising water by inches, did not think about naval history or the evolution of warfare. They thought about the men who had not made it out, about the moment when the ship rolled, about the sound of the water and the cold and the taste of oil. They would carry those thoughts for the rest of their lives. While Repulse burned and broke apart in the western reaches of the search area, Prince of Wales was undergoing her own catastrophe 2 miles to the eastward. The new battleship, already gutted by the first torpedo strike that had jammed her rudder hard to starboard and flooded the compartments housing her starboard propeller shafts, was now a ship fighting for her existence against waves of attackers who understood perfectly that she was crippled and growing weaker by the minute. The Japanese air crews, emboldened by the success of their strikes and coordinated through hand signals and formation flying, pressed their assault with a rhythm and precision that no amount of anti-aircraft fire from Prince of Wales could break. Captain John Leach, commanding from her bridge, faced a mathematics of survival that grew crueler with each passing minute. His ship was listing to starboard, her speed already reduced to a crawl, her ability to maneuver nearly gone, and the enemy above showed no signs of relenting. The damage that had come first, in those early minutes of the battle, had transformed Prince of Wales from a modern warship into a wounded animal. The torpedo that struck her amidships on the starboard side had not merely caused flooding, it had penetrated to the heart of her mechanical systems, rendering her incapable of swift response or evasive turning. The men working in the engine rooms and boiler spaces, unaware at first of what was happening above, felt the shock and the sudden, sickening list. Officers in damage control parties scrambled through compartments filling with seawater, attempting to shore up watertight doors and counterflood selected spaces to reduce the list. But the fundamental physics were immutable. A ship struck below the waterline, with restricted power and a jammed rudder, becomes a sitting target. The anti-aircraft gunners, who had fought with remarkable discipline through the opening phases of the attack, now found themselves struggling to track fast-moving aircraft and maintain their fire as the deck beneath them tilted and swayed with each passing minute. What made the final hour of Prince of Wales a horror, distinct from simple sinking, was the rhythm of attack. Japanese bomber and torpedo aircraft, having achieved the coordinated strike that crippled the battleship, returned again and again in smaller groups, each one finding a target whose defensive capability was visibly diminishing. The high-level bombers, working at altitude where the flak barrage became increasingly sparse, released their ordnance with machine-like precision. Explosions walked across the battleship's superstructure, setting fires that consumed ammunition passages and engine room spaces, cutting power to more anti-aircraft stations, and filling the air with acrid smoke that made it nearly impossible for the gun crews to see the sky from which death was falling. Torpedo aircraft made their runs against a ship that could now neither run at speed nor turn sharply to comb their track. Each new detonation, each fresh column of water that erupted alongside the hull, pushed the old battleship deeper and tighter toward the moment when she would roll over and go under. Admiral Tom Phillips, the small man whose certainty about the power of capital ships had never wavered, and whose skepticism about air power had never been tempered by the evidence unfolding above him, remained on the bridge of his flagship until the very last moments. What his final thoughts were, no living witness could fully convey, because Phillips and his flag captain would go down with the ship. In his last minutes, with Prince of Wales listing so heavily that men were sliding across the tilted deck, and the order to abandon ship finally given, he chose to remain at his post, rather than move to a lifeboat. This was not the romantic gesture of legend. It was perhaps the only action left to a commander who had led his ships to catastrophe through a combination of underestimation and fatalism. The crew, numbering more than 1,300 officers and men, began the terrible scramble for safety as the ship's list became ever steeper. Life jackets were donned in the smoke and confusion. Men who had trained for years aboard this vessel, who knew her passages and her rhythms, now moved through her as she was being transformed from a home into a tomb. The destroyers that had sailed alongside Force Z, HMS Electra, HMS Express, HMS Tenedos, and HMS Vampire, performed a transformation of their own in those final hours. From vessels maintaining formation and supporting the capital ships, they became rescue vessels, operating under continued threat of air attack. The commanding officers of these smaller warships, understanding that the window for saving men from the water was limited and that Japanese aircraft might return at any moment, positioned their ships to windward of the sinking battleship and began the desperate work of pulling men from the sea. The water temperature in the South China Sea in December was roughly 75 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough that men could survive for hours, but cold enough when combined with wounds, shock, and exhaustion to pull strength away rapidly. The destroyers threw over scrambling nets, lines, and ladders. Their crews pulled and hauled until their arms burned, bringing soaked, oil-covered sailors and warrant officers aboard. But the sheer numbers of men in the water spread across a widening area as the battleship's death throes pushed wreckage and survivors ever further outward, meant that many had to be left behind, treading water and hoping that the ships would return or that rescue would come from some other quarter. The list of Prince of Wales accelerated as the afternoon wore on. What had been a slow, catastrophic roll became a rapid descent. The ship's engineering officer, attempting to maintain some control over her final moments, managed to keep what little power remained available to him, focused on keeping her lights on and her communications running as long as possible. But with each passing minute, fewer circuits carried power, fewer compartments remained above water, and the angle of her hull became more extreme. Men who had already abandoned ship found themselves watching from the deck of a destroyer as their vessel, the command center of the Eastern Fleet, the battleship that had fought Bismarck and survived, simply gave up the struggle against the sea. The list reached an angle where nothing could remain upright on her deck. Equipment that had been secured by cables now tore free under the force of gravity and the motion of the water. The superstructure, that towering castle of steel that had dominated the horizon at Singapore just hours before, was now tilted so severely that it pointed almost horizontally into the water. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon local time, on the 10th of December, 1941, Prince of Wales rolled onto her beam ends and her stern began to sink. The water that had poured through her wound, that had flooded her engine rooms and burst through her damage control efforts, finally claimed her completely. The battleship that had represented Britain's imperial power and her commitment to holding the Far East slipped beneath the surface of the South China Sea with a sound described by survivors as something between a shriek and a groan, the protest of stressed steel and the whisper of air escaping from sealed compartments as she sank into the darkness. Men in the water watched their ship disappear. Some found themselves swimming directly over the spot where the bridge had been, where Admiral Phillips had made his final stand. The suction created by the sinking pulled some men down toward the wreck, and they had to struggle to swim away, their limited strength nearly overcome by the downward drag of 830,000 tons of steel returning to the ocean that had held it. The destroyers continued their rescue work, even as Prince of Wales vanished, and the number of men brought aboard was remarkable, given the constraints under which the rescue operated. HMS Vampire, the Australian destroyer, pulled several hundred men from the water, despite the risk of remaining in the attack zone. The British destroyers likewise persisted, their decks becoming crowded with soaked, shocked, and injured sailors. But the very success of the attack meant that scores of men remained in the water, scattered across several square miles of ocean, visible to one another, but separated by distance and exhaustion. The destroyers, having pulled roughly 1,000 men from the sea, faced a calculation of their own, whether to remain longer and continue the rescue, risking further air attack and potentially losing themselves in the process, or to withdraw towards Singapore and deliver the survivors they had already saved, while there was still light enough to navigate safely. The decision was a terrible one, and it was one that would haunt survivors and their families for the rest of their lives. The destroyers eventually withdrew, leaving men behind in the water. Some of those left behind were picked up hours later or the following day by fishing vessels, merchant ships, and other rescue craft that converged on the area once the scale of the disaster became known. Others were not found. The total number of men lost from Prince of Wales would never be precisely established, but it was more than 300 officers and men who went down with the ship or succumbed to the sea in its aftermath. The survivors who were pulled aboard the destroyers found themselves crowded onto vessels that were far too small to accommodate them comfortably. They were wrapped in whatever cloth and blankets could be spared, given water and the most basic first aid, and held below deck while the destroyers made best speed back towards Singapore. alert for any further sign of Japanese aircraft. Many of these men were in shock, unaware whether friends and shipmates were alive or dead, unable to process that the immense battleship that had been their world was now at the bottom of the ocean. The news of Prince of Wales's sinking reached Singapore even before the destroyers carrying the first survivors began their approach to the naval base. The initial reports were confused, tinged with desperate hope that the ship might have escaped, that she might have made it to safety, that reports of her loss were premature or exaggerated. But as the day wore on and the evidence accumulated, the truth became impossible to deny. Force Z, the great counterweight to Japanese expansion, the symbol of British naval power in the Far East, was gone. Not one capital ship remained in the entire Indian Ocean or the Western Pacific under British control. The Philippine-American coast had no battleships in the region to defend it. The Australian coast knew that the ocean no longer contained a single Allied capital ship between them and the enemy. The strategic world had been rewritten in the space of a few hours, and it had been rewritten by aircraft attacking ships at sea. The very scenario that Admiral Phillips and many of his peers had never truly believed would happen. The moment that Prince of Wales slipped beneath the surface marked more than the end of two magnificent ships, and more than the loss of more than 1,000 men across both vessels. It marked the end of an entire conception of how sea power worked and what battleships could accomplish. For decades, naval strategy had been built around the assumption that capital ships, battleships, and battlecruisers were the decisive weapons of naval warfare, that their guns could decide the outcome of any engagement, and that smaller vessels and aircraft existed primarily to support them. The destruction of Force Z in a few hours, accomplished entirely by air attack, against which the ship's anti-aircraft armament could not defend effectively, had proven that assumption catastrophically wrong. The men dying in the water, the men being pulled aboard the destroyers, the men watching from the shore as the sun set on the 10th of December, 1941, were all participants in a historical transition that few of them understood in that moment. The age of the battleship had not ended with a whimper or a gradual fading. It had ended in fire and explosions, under a grey sky, in waters that would keep the wrecks as monuments and memorials for generations to come. At the Singapore Air Base, on the morning of the 10th of December 1941, a pattern of urgency had taken hold that few would later remember with clarity. The sun was climbing toward noon. Radio traffic crackled across the operations room with fragments of conflicting information. Reports of Japanese aircraft sighted, unconfirmed positions, distances that shifted from one transmission to the next. The RAF officers and ground crew who staffed this frontline station existed in a state of half-readiness that had become habitual by now. 3 days of Japanese operations had already taught them that nothing arrived as scheduled. Nothing unfolded as the maps and briefing notes suggested it would. Yet on this particular morning, a decision was made to keep the fighter squadrons grounded a moment longer, to wait for clearer confirmation of where exactly Admiral Phillips's Force Z had sailed and where exactly it might need protection. That single decision, made in a room filled with tired men trying to interpret garbled signals, would remain one of the most consequential failures of Britain's entire Far East campaign. The Brewster Buffalo fighter aircraft were parked in dispersed positions around the aerodrome, their pilots either resting in the ready rooms or standing in small groups beneath the merciless heat, occasionally glancing skyward. The Buffalo was not a machine that inspired confidence, even under the best circumstances. It was slow by the standards of the moment, sluggish in climb, and outmatched in almost every respect by the Japanese Zero fighters that were now operating across the theater. But these aircraft and their pilots were what Singapore possessed, and they represented the only air cover that Force Z could hope to receive. By mid-morning, the tension in the operations room had reached a threshold where action could no longer be deferred. A report came through that Japanese aircraft were approaching the waters where the capital ships were believed to be operating. The scramble order was finally issued. Pilots broke from their shelters and ran toward their machines. Ground crews spun up engines, and within minutes, the first fighters were accelerating down the runway into the humid Malaysian sky. But those minutes, however brief they seemed in the confusion of action, had already become far too many. The arithmetic of combat at sea is unforgiving. The Japanese bomber and torpedo aircraft had launched from their bases in Indochina hours before, had found Force Z in its vulnerability, and were already executing their attacks with a coordination and ferocity that no amount of warning could have prevented. The buffaloes that climbed away from Singapore were flying toward a battle that had already reached its climax and was now descending into its catastrophic conclusion. The pilots had no way of knowing this with precision. Radio communication between the airbase and the ships had been inconsistent at best, and Admiral Phillips, maintaining radio silence for much of the sortie, had not been transmitting his position or his situation reports with any regularity. The fighters climbed to altitude, their pilots searching the haze and glare of the South China Sea below them for some sign of the battleship and battlecruiser they had been ordered to protect. What they found instead was a scene that would scar the memory of every man who witnessed it. The wrecks were already sliding beneath the surface when the first RAF pilots reached the engagement area. Repulse had gone down some time earlier, her hull broken, and her final list so severe that men still clinging to her superstructure had slid into the sea as she rolled. Prince of Wales, the larger and more modern of the two vessels, had lingered longer, but the damage inflicted upon her was too comprehensive to survive. The torpedo hits had crippled her from the beginning. The bombs that followed had methodically dismantled her fighting capability. By the time the buffaloes appeared in the sky above the chaos, both capital ships were either sinking or already gone. The Japanese aircraft had finished their work and were withdrawing. What remained was not a battle, but a disaster in its final, irreversible phase. The pilots circled at altitude, watching the last moments of British naval power in the Far East dissolve into the dark water below. Some of them were junior officers on their first operations. Others were veterans of months of combat already. None of them had ever witnessed anything like this before. The human cost of the disaster lay scattered across the ocean in an area many miles wide. Survivors clung to rafts, flotsam, and pieces of wreckage. Men who had jumped from decks as the ships went down. Men who had worked in engine rooms until the final seconds, and then climbed desperately toward daylight and air. Men who had been working in gun positions and turrets when the power failed and left them stumbling in the dark. The destroyers that had accompanied Force Z on its sortie had maneuvered back into the midst of the carnage and were attempting rescue operations under circumstances that defied coordination or calm. Ships' boats were lowered, nets were thrown over the sides. Officers and ratings worked with urgent discipline to haul survivors from the water, even as the ocean itself remained a threat. Men drowning under their own weight, men too exhausted to grip the ropes that might have saved them, men going into shock as they were dragged aboard. The RAF pilots above could see all of this. They could see the extent of the disaster with a clarity that their commanders back at Singapore could not yet comprehend. They could see that they were too late, and there was nothing their fighters could have done to prevent it. The anguish that seized these pilots was real and immediate and entirely without remedy. They had been ordered to protect Force Z. They had scrambled as quickly as human beings could manage. The delays in the decision to launch, delays caused by confusion in the chain of command, delays caused by uncertainty about where exactly the ships were located, delays caused by the simple friction that occurs whenever large organizations attempt to coordinate action in conditions of incomplete information. These delays had passed beyond their control and beyond anyone's ability to reverse. The Buffaloes circled above the wreckage, their pilots knowing that they were witnessing the end of something vast, and that they had been powerless to stop it. Some of them attempted to drop supplies or bandages to survivors in the water, knowing even as they did so, how little such gestures could accomplish. Others simply flew their patterns and observed, trying to absorb the reality of what had unfolded beneath the clear sky. The experience would remain with them for the rest of their lives, a permanent stain on their professional consciousnesses. They had been fighters, trained to fight, and they had arrived at a moment when all fighting was already finished. What the air cover failure revealed went far deeper than the simple miscommunication or delay of a single scramble order. It exposed a fundamental dysfunction within the entire British Far East command structure, a dysfunction that had been building for months and perhaps for years before a single shot was fired in anger. The Singapore airbase did not have reliable liaison with Admiral Phillips's fleet. The communication systems were inadequate for coordinating movements across the distances involved. The command and control relationships between the RAF and the Royal Navy in this theatre had never been properly clarified or tested. There was no established protocol for requesting air cover, no reliable way of knowing where the capital ships were at any given moment, and no mechanism for feeding intelligence from the air to the ships that needed it most urgently. These failures were not the fault of individual officers or airmen. They were systemic. They were organizational. They reflected the reality that Britain's defense apparatus in the Far East had been constructed with assumptions and doctrines that had become obsolete even as they were being implemented. The RAF still existed partly to serve the Navy, but the Navy still refused to fully accept that air power had become the dominant factor in naval warfare. Neither service had fully adapted to the reality that the two capital ships could not operate effectively without continuous fighter protection, and that providing such protection required integration and coordination that the available systems simply could not deliver. The broader picture of British institutional failure in this period extends further still. The procurement of fighter aircraft for the Far East had been inadequate. The Buffalo, which was the primary machine available to defend Singapore, was technologically inferior to the Japanese aircraft it would encounter. But this was not merely a matter of individual aircraft performance. It reflected deeper choices made at the highest levels of British defence planning. Choices that assumed the threat in the Far East would remain manageable, that reinforcements from other theatres could always be diverted if a crisis emerged, and that the presence of capital ships would deter Japanese aggression without requiring the level of air support that modern warfare actually demanded. These assumptions had proven catastrophically wrong. By the time the Buffaloes were scrambling on the 10th of December, those assumptions were already in the process of being shattered. The aircraft came too late, because the entire framework of defense in Malaya and Singapore had been built on a foundation of miscalculation and hope rather than realistic assessment. The pilots who circled above the wreckage of Force Z were paying the price for decisions made years earlier by men they had never met, in offices thousands of miles away. The communication breakdown that had delayed the scramble order must be understood not as an isolated failure, but as symptomatic of broader problems in how information flowed through the British command structure. Admiral Phillips, who maintained radio silence as a security measure, did not keep shore-based commanders fully informed of his position or his intentions. The RAF operations room at Singapore relied on reports from various sources, reconnaissance aircraft, signal intercepts, radio direction finding stations, but these sources were often contradictory and usually delayed. The Japanese themselves had achieved a remarkable degree of coordination across their attacking forces, using systems of communication and command that were, in some respects, more effective than the British systems that were supposed to defend against them. The British fighters finally launched and flew to where they thought Force Z might be found, but by the time they reached those waters, there was nothing left to protect. The pilots had to circle above survivors in the water and depart, knowing that their presence, however welcome it might be to the men below, could not change the fundamental fact that both capital ships were already lost. One of the most poignant aspects of the RAF's arrival at the battle scene was the inability of the pilots to render any meaningful assistance to the thousands of men struggling in the water. They could see the destroyers Electra and Express performing their desperate rescue work, could see the lifeboats being rowed among the survivors, could see the ocean itself as a vast and terrible field of human suffering. What they could not do was land on the water and pick people up. What they could not do was provide any sort of medical care to the exhausted, injured, and shocked men who were being pulled from the sea. Their machine guns and bombs and high-speed maneuverability were useless in this context. They had come to provide fighter protection against enemy aircraft, and there were no enemy aircraft to fight against anymore. The Japanese had already withdrawn from the area. The Buffaloes served no further purpose. They could only watch, and then they had to turn back towards Singapore, their fuel depleted, their mission incomplete in any meaningful sense. The pilots landed back at the airbase, knowing that they had failed, even though the failure was not theirs, and even though no one on Earth could have done better under the circumstances. The question of what might have changed if the fighters had arrived earlier remains one of the most haunting counterfactuals in the history of the Far Eastern Campaign. Japanese fighter cover was not present during the initial phases of the attack on Force Z. The Zeros that accompanied the Japanese bomber and torpedo aircraft were few in number and were primarily focused on maintaining combat air patrol above the strike formations. If the RAF Buffaloes had been on station when the Japanese aircraft arrived, they might have disrupted the initial attack waves. They might have shot down some of the bombers before they could release their ordnance. They might have forced the Japanese formations to take evasive action, causing some of the torpedo runs to fail, or some of the bomb drops to be inaccurate. Whether this would have been sufficient to save either ship remains unclear. The damage that Prince of Wales sustained from her first torpedo hit was probably fatal, regardless of what air cover could have provided. But the presence of fighters might have degraded the effectiveness of the Japanese assault enough that Repulse, with her superior maneuverability and her experienced crew, might have survived long enough for a destroyer to be sunk alongside her and for her entire company to be evacuated. The calculations of naval warfare are never simple, and the presence of fighter aircraft would not have completely negated the disaster. But the evidence suggests that it might have reduced it, and that possibility would haunt the RAF officers and airmen involved for the rest of their lives. The arrival of the Buffaloes and their inability to intervene served as a symbolic moment in the collapse of British naval power in the Far East. The fighters appeared at precisely the moment when the age of the battleship was ending and the age of carrier-based aircraft was definitively beginning. The capital ships that had represented Britain's naval strength, that had been sent to Singapore with such fanfare and such political theatre, had proven unable to defend themselves against aircraft at a distance greater than their guns could reach. The fighters that should have provided that protection had arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. The destroyers that had accompanied Force Z had done extraordinary work in rescuing survivors, but they could not undo the fundamental catastrophe. Every system designed to prevent or mitigate this disaster had failed. The intelligence system, the communications system, the command structure, the procurement of appropriate aircraft, the doctrinal understanding of how modern navies should be organized and defended. The pilots who circled above the wreckage of Force Z were witnesses to the end of an era. They could see it unfolding beneath them in the dark water and the scattered debris and the desperate human struggle for survival. The emotional and psychological toll on the pilots and ground crew at Singapore in the hours and days after Force Z went down was substantial and largely unprocessed by any formal mechanism. These men had believed, or had been told to believe, that the arrival of capital ships would strengthen the defense of Malaya and Singapore, would boost morale, would deter Japanese aggression. Instead, within 3 days, those ships had been destroyed, their admiral was dead, and the strategic situation had become catastrophically worse. The fighters had been scrambled with the understanding that they might be able to save the situation, and they had arrived to find that the situation was beyond saving. This created a particular kind of trauma, the trauma of failure despite maximum effort, the trauma of arriving to help and finding that help was meaningless, the broader institutional failure to prepare the theatre adequately, to coordinate the RAF and Navy effectively, to provide appropriate air cover and equipment, became focused in the minds of these men as a personal failure, even though it was nothing of the kind. The buffaloes that had scrambled from Singapore represented the very best that human effort and courage could produce under the circumstances. That it had not been enough was not the fault of the pilots or the ground crews. It was the fault of systems and decisions that extended far above them, far back in time, and far beyond their control to alter. The radio operators in Singapore had been waiting for hours. They knew Force Z was at sea. They knew, by the 10th of December, that something was wrong. The silence that should have brought comfort, radio discipline, operational security, had become unbearable. And then, at 10:30 in the morning, local time, a garbled distress signal arrived. Not a full account, not a clear picture, just fragments of urgency and noise, suggesting that both ships were under heavy attack, somewhere in the Gulf of Thailand, beyond any possibility of immediate rescue. Within minutes, that fragmentary report began its journey outward from Singapore to London, to Washington, to Tokyo, and to every corner of a world already convulsed by war. The men and women receiving it would spend the rest of their lives understanding what it meant. In London, Winston Churchill was at his country residence when the news reached him. He was in his study, working through the morning's papers and strategic updates, when a messenger brought the telegram. It was late afternoon in Britain, the sun already falling toward winter darkness, when he read the confirmation that both Prince of Wales and Repulse had been sunk. His secretary would later record that she had never seen him so shaken. Churchill, the man who had authored so many declarations of defiance, who had sent the ships east in the first place to stiffen the spines of the Far East commanders, sat in silence for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued and heavy. He said, simply, that it was a catastrophe. Not a setback, not a costly action, a catastrophe. He had believed, genuinely believed, that the mere presence of a modern battleship in Singapore would be enough to deter Japanese aggression. He had overridden the doubts of his naval advisors. He had pushed the decision through against internal dissent, and now both ships were at the bottom of the sea, along with more than 800 men, and the strategic map of the entire war in the East had been redrawn in a single morning. Churchill spent that evening writing letters to the First Sea Lord, to the chiefs of staff, examining how it had happened, knowing full well that the responsibility, in the end, fell to him. In Washington, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received the news with the same sense of shock, though his reaction was tempered by a grimmer realism. The United States had only been in the war for 3 days. Pearl Harbor had been apocalyptic, the loss of battleships, aircraft, and thousands of men, but it had at least produced a unified American commitment to war. This news from Singapore was different. It suggested that Britain's position in the Far East was collapsing faster than anyone in Washington had anticipated. Roosevelt understood, immediately, the strategic implications. With Prince of Wales and Repulse gone, with the American battleships crippled at Pearl Harbor, there was now not a single capital ship remaining in either the Indian Ocean or the Pacific Ocean that could challenge Japanese naval superiority. The Japanese fleet, intact and triumphant, held complete dominance over the most strategically vital region in the world. Roosevelt called his military advisors to the White House. They studied the maps, traced the Japanese movements in Malaya, examined the vulnerability of the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. The unanimity of their assessment was chilling. The Japanese, they concluded, had achieved in a matter of days something that would have taken them months to accomplish through conventional military operations. They had shattered the belief, held in both London and Washington, that capital ships were the ultimate arbiter of naval warfare, and by doing so, they had created a strategic vacuum in the entire Western Pacific that no Allied force could immediately fill. In Tokyo, the news was received with jubilation. Japanese military planners had gambled everything on the assumption that they could execute their coordinated strikes. Pearl Harbor, the invasion of Malaya, the assault on the Philippines, before the Allies could mount an effective response. The loss of Force Z proved, beyond any doubt, that their gamble had succeeded beyond their most optimistic calculations. Japanese radio broadcasts immediately announced the victory with triumphant language. The sinking of the 2 British capital ships was presented not as the result of tactical surprise, but as proof of the inherent superiority of Japanese naval aviation and the invincibility of Japanese forces. Japanese newspapers trumpeted the news with banner headlines. Celebrations broke out in cities across Japan. The military hierarchy, which had been under increasing pressure from a skeptical public and political opposition, suddenly found themselves vindicated. The Navy, in particular, which had been the subject of intense rivalry with the Army for resources and strategic priority, could now point to the destruction of Britain's greatest assets in the Far East. It was a magnificent opening to their greater campaign. Tokyo was already planning the next phase, the seizure of Malaya, the invasion of Singapore itself, the advance into the Dutch East Indies to secure oil fields and other vital resources. Force Z's destruction had not merely sunk 2 ships, it had removed the only military obstacle that could have imposed a meaningful delay on Japanese operations. But the psychological impact of the news extended far beyond the corridors of power and the military headquarters where strategic calculations were being revised. The sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse struck at something deeper in the collective consciousness of the British Empire and the Allied cause. For more than a century, the British battleship had been the symbol of imperial power. It was the instrument through which Britain had maintained naval supremacy across the globe, the tangible expression of British technological mastery and military might. Battleships had dominated naval warfare since the dawn of the 20th century. They had fought at Jutland in 1916. They had been refitted, upgraded, and rebuilt through the interwar years. They represented the very pinnacle of what human engineering and military organization could achieve. And now, 2 of them had been destroyed in a single day by aircraft. by carrierless aircraft launching from land bases in Indochina, by pilots trained specifically for this kind of warfare, by a nation that much of the Western world had still been inclined to regard as inferior to European military powers. The sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse was not merely a military defeat. It was a blow to the credibility of the